For a few years, I tried my hand at scrapping in my area for a living, and surprisingly, I did pretty well for myself. Scrap metal was abundant in my town, and people would even offer to pay me to take their dead utilities like washing machines and ovens off their hands, which I would then take to the scrapyard and make a quick little bit of money. Now, a big source of my contacts ended up coming from social media, such as Instagram or Facebook Marketplace, and for the most part, everything went smoothly. But every now and then, I would get a shady seeming opportunity that I would have to think twice about. I'll never forget when I was messaged on Facebook to pick up a broken lawnmower and a torn down shed from a property about an hour away from my house. It was in September of 2017, and I typically didn't pick up scrap after dark because the yard was usually closed by then. But it seemed like this guy had a lot for me to pick up, and he claimed to only be able to meet after he got home from work around 6 p.m. So I figured, why not? What's the worst that could happen, right? The day came that I was supposed to meet him, and I messaged him to confirm that everything was still good to go. And once I got the okay, I hopped into my truck and began making my way to the man's house. There wasn't much traffic, so the drive only took about 45 minutes. But by the time I got to the small, one-lane road where the man lived, the sun had already set. The road was surrounded by thick woods on either side of it, and it almost looked like the guy's house was the only one on the entire road. After driving a bit down the one-lane road, I finally saw a beat-up looking mailbox that had the number 43 on it, which let me know that I had reached my destination. I slowly pulled into the driveway, and the first thing that I noticed was how overgrown the yard looked. From the looks of things, the lawnmower had been broken for some time. As I got closer to the house, I could tell from the dim light shining through the window that the owner was home. I parked my truck, and before I could take my phone out to send the man a message, I noticed someone coming out of the front door. It looked like the guy that I was there to meet, so I shut my truck off and stepped outside. As soon as my foot touched the pavement, I practically jumped out of my skin when I heard what sounded like a very large dog barking. The man came down the stairs and claimed that I didn't have anything to worry about and said the dog was inside. But I still couldn't help but flinch with every step I took, wondering if I was going to be attacked. I did my best to follow the man around as I began gathering all the scrap metal that he had for me. But about halfway through my trips, back and forth from the yard to my truck, I couldn't help but feel like I was hearing the sound of a child screaming underneath the sound of the loud barking. I tried to remain calm as I said my goodbye to the man, and as soon as I hit the road, I pulled my phone out and called my wife to tell her what just happened. She was concerned with what I had heard and said that I should call the police, and I was happy that I did. I informed the officer that I heard a child crying and what sounded like an aggressive animal inside a rundown home. And when they showed up, they ended up finding a small child who did not belong to the owner. It turned out to be a missing child from 2 states away who had been missing for more than 3 weeks at that time. There was also reportedly no dog on site, and the police believe the man was using the recording of a dog barking that was being played over speakers to try to drown out the child for crying for help. When the case went to court, it turned out that the only reason he needed the scrap removed in the first place was that his landlord was going to evict him if he didn't get it out of there.
Alright, so this occurred when I was 16, and because of what happened, I will never use social media again. It was getting near the end of the school year, which meant that we would have the summer off in a couple of weeks. It also meant that teachers would let the class have free time and rarely give out assignments. Anyway, I was in class sitting with my friends chatting as our teacher did give us free time. We were pretty much talking about all the things girls in high school would talk about. What we were doing over the summer, college, jobs, a car, and even graduation. As one of my friends was talking about how her boss just fired her from her job, I got a notification from Facebook on my phone a username that I have never seen before sent me a friend request. Let me be as clear as I can. Getting friend requests from unknown users is no big surprise to me. What I would do is if I knew the person, I would accept their request and request to be their friend as well, but if I didn't know who they were, I would just accept the request or decline it. In this case, I didn't know who this person was, so I declined him. Just then, I received another notification on my phone from Facebook. It was the same username, and he sent me a direct message. It read something along the lines of, "Hey, you're really pretty. Would you like to chat?" I responded telling him that I didn't know who he was and apologized. Keep in mind, this guy looked to be about 40 and I was 18 at the time, so this was starting to become very creepy. My friends eventually wanted to see what I was up to, and so I showed them the chat. Two of my friends really didn't care, and the others said to just block him. I felt like blocking him wouldn't be the right thing to do at the time, so I just left it alone. When I got home, I received another notification on my phone from the same guy. He said that we will get to know each other and that we would start a, quote, romantic relationship. I was beyond creeped out at this point, and so I blocked him and thought it was over. I'd say not even 10 minutes later, I received another message from Facebook, but with a different username. It read, "Why did you block me? I want to get to know you." I told him to leave me alone, and that he was way too older than me, and that if he didn't stop, that I would call the police and report him. He then started using profanity and making threats, and that he was going to find me and kill me. I blocked him once again and called the cops, but of course they couldn't do anything since he really didn't commit a crime. I find that BS, but whatever. His account was also taken down, and even if the police could track him, I couldn't remember his username. About a week or so went by, and I was starting to forget about what happened. I just wanted to graduate high school and be done. But a few days later, I was home alone in my room on my computer when I heard my dogs barking at something. I went to go see what they were barking at. They were barking at something outside of the sliding glass door, but I couldn't see anything since it was dark out there. I looked a bit harder, and I could see someone standing in our yard, looking straight at me. He then took off running, and I never saw him again. I have no idea if whoever that was the person on Facebook, but I believe that it might have been.
For the longest time, I was looking for a specific Funko Pop from a limited Marvel series that had come out. I've been collecting them ever since I was with my ex-boyfriend, who actually got me into comic books. And even though we had a pretty nasty breakup, I still wanted to complete my collection and continue to love everything Marvel and DC. Well, after about 3 years of looking for the final pop that I needed for my collection, I saw that someone named Aaron had listed it for sale on the Facebook Marketplace. After exchanging a couple messages, we both figured out a good time to meet, which ended up being around 8 p.m. the following night. The two of us agreed to meet at the mall because Aaron claimed to have some clothes shopping to do, and I actually needed to pick up my younger brother from his job at the pretzel stand, so it worked out. When the time came, I pulled into the mall parking lot at the entrance closest to the JCPenney, which was where we agreed to meet. And before I even made it to an empty parking spot, I recognized my ex's car. James loved his red Miata, and we took so many pictures of it that I could pick it out from a lineup. I decided that I didn't want to deal with him, so I ended up driving over to the movie theater parking lot and sending Aaron a message letting him know I was there. However, about 2 minutes after I sent the message, I noticed that Aaron had seen it, but not replied, and before I could send him another message to make sure that he actually saw it, I saw James in my rearview mirror walking toward my car. I'm glad the car was locked, because as he walked up to my door, he tried to open it. When he realized he couldn't, he began yelling through the window, asking me to just hear him out. I ignored him and pulled out my phone to message Aaron and my brother to let them know what was happening. But when he saw Aaron's name on my phone, James said something that surprised me. "He's not coming, you know," he said. I looked up at him, confused as to why he would say something like that. That was when he let me know that he was James and created the account and the marketplace post because I had been ignoring him. I immediately began to freak out and began texting my brother, letting him know that I would meet him in a different parking lot. There was no way I was getting out of the car at that point. But the more I ignored James to text my brother, the angrier he got. And eventually he got so mad that he began smacking my window to get my attention. I turned my car on, and as I put my car in reverse, James smacking turned to him punching, and I screamed as he began trying to break my window and yelling at me to stop. He kept yelling, "I just want to talk to you." But I had never seen him so angry. I pulled out as fast as I could in fear of my life and began driving around the mall wondering where I would be safe to pick up my brother. I was afraid that James was following me. Eventually, my brother texted me back and told me that he was standing outside of the entrance near the side of the mall and that I could swing by and pick him up. I liked this plan because I didn't have to actually park. I grabbed my brother and we began driving home. The entire time I was paranoid that James was following me. Thankfully, there was no sign of him after returning to my house. My father ended up messaging his parents and letting them know that if he stepped foot near me again, we would be filing a restraining order. That was the last time I heard from him, but I'll never forget the look on his face as he tried to break my window to get to me. I had just purchased a new car after finally saving up enough money, and since my driveway had limited space, I decided to sell the Hyundai that I used to drive. I tried asking around to see if any of my friends or family members might need a car, but when no one was offering to buy it, I decided to list it on the Facebook Marketplace. It was a 2003 Sonata with 140,000 miles. And based on what I saw similar cars going for on the site, I listed it for $4,000 or best offer. I was a little surprised at how long it took before someone finally messaged me about the car, but after about 2 weeks, I finally felt like I had a solid offer. I had to drop the asking price to $3,400, but when the guy messaged me, offered to pay cash, I decided to take the money rather than wait for a better offer. The man's name, according to Facebook, was Lucas, and after discussing it, he asked me if I would be able to meet him at a garage that he supposedly owned. He claimed to not have a working vehicle at the moment and was hoping I would be able to drop the car off. And not thinking anything of it, I checked to see how far the garage was from my house and asked my friend if he would follow me in his car and drive me home after I made the sale. My buddy Jeremy said that it wouldn't be a problem, and when the time came, I drove over to Jeremy's house so that he could follow behind me till we got to the garage. The route to the garage was mostly highway for the first 15 or so minutes of the drive, and then we had to take the side roads for another 5 minutes before the GPS told me that I had reached my destination. I could see the garage, but in my rear view, there was no sign of Jeremy. I figured that I must have lost him at the light or something, but considering I put the address into his phone, I figured he would be there shortly. I planned on waiting in the car until he got there, but before I could message Lucas to let him know what was going on, I could see 3 men coming out from the side of the garage. I tried to see if any of them looked like Lucas's profile picture, but as far as I could tell, he wasn't there. I hoped that they just happened to be walking in the direction of my car and were just going to pass me. Sadly, that's not what happened. As the 3 men got closer to my car, I could tell that they were heading right for me. I smiled and nodded, thinking that maybe they just wanted to know who I was and why I was there. But before I could even begin rolling down my window, the man closest to me pulled a gun out of his waistband and pointed it in my direction. My hands instinctively left the steering wheel and went up in the air as I hoped and prayed for him not to pull the trigger. His 2 friends approached my door and opened it with ease as I didn't have the chance to lock it. And before I knew it, I was on the ground. I tried not to make any sudden moves as the men loaded into my car, and within a second, they were pulling away. It all happened in under a minute, and I was in absolute shock. On one hand, I was glad to be alive, but on the other, I was still really confused about what just happened to me. I got up off the ground and looked down the road to see if Jeremy had caught up yet, but there was no sign of his car. I walked over to the garage and looked inside, and that was when I realized that I had been conned from the beginning. Through a window, I could see that the garage had been abandoned for God knows how long, and before I even pulled out my phone to check, I knew that Lucas had used a fake profile. I opened up Facebook and tried to find his profile only to discover that his account had been deleted, even though it was active right before I pulled up to the garage. I called the police while I waited for Jeremy to arrive and reported the car stolen. Jeremy eventually showed up, and the two of us got out of there as fast as we could. Every now and then, I wonder what happened with that car, but as far as I know, the police never found it. All I know is I'll never use Facebook to sell something like that again.
My name is Jamie. A few years ago, several strange things started happening. It all began around Facebook. I logged into my account one day to find a new message from somebody. I used Facebook pretty regularly at the time, and I had for years. Over all the time that I had a Facebook, I received hundreds of friend requests. I certainly didn't know many of the people on my friends list. I would probably get about 5 to 10 friend requests per week on average, and most of the time I would just accept them. The message that I had received looked like spam. It was like multiple links, and those links were really long. There was no text to go along with the links, and I didn't open them. It was sent from some guy with no profile picture. I figured that he was some spam account, and I accidentally accepted a friend request from him or something in the past. I deleted the conversation and unfriended the guy, but only the next day, I got a very similar message. It was from another user. This time, the user did have a profile picture, but it was really generic. I think it was just a logo of a sports team. This person had also sent some random links. By now, I was suspecting that there was some type of Facebook hack going around, and spam messages were being sent. I just deleted them and went on, but they didn't stop. The next day, I had spam messages from multiple accounts. I was wondering what was going on. Then, the day after that is when things got even weirder and took a creepy twist. I saw that I had a friend request, and when I looked at it, the username was Jamie Smith Sucks. Jamie Smith is actually my real name, and I also got a friend request with somebody with the username Jamie Smith is an idiot. I clicked on these profiles, and they looked like they had just been created. Somebody was seemingly trying to mess with me. I didn't know who, and I didn't know why. Obviously, I declined those goofy friend requests, and I decided that I would not go on Facebook for a few days. I deleted the app from my phone, and I didn't go on it through my laptop either, but I couldn't escape the strange things. The next day or two went by fine, but then, one night at about midnight, there was a knock on my front door. I lived by myself in an apartment, and I walked over to the door wondering who would be there so late. No one was there when I looked. The next day, this happened again. A knocking at my door, but nobody was there when I looked outside. The day after that, I left my place to find that there was a picture on the floor right in front of my door. The picture was my Facebook profile pic, and it appeared as though somebody had just printed it off on a piece of paper. This was really starting to concern me, but I had no idea what could be done about it. The last straw was the next day. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I was home in my apartment. There was once again another knocking at my front door. Immediately following the knock, I heard that the knob to the door was turned. Luckily, the door was in fact locked. I walked over and looked out. No one was there again. I opened up the door, and on the ground was at least 100 pieces of paper with my profile picture printed on them. They were all stacked in a pile. I took them all and went to the police the next day. I told them everything and made a report. Beyond that, there wasn't much that I could do. But surprisingly, After I went to the police, everything just stopped. There was no more knocks at my door, no more things left outside, and no more weird Facebook messages or friend requests. I still don't know who did that to me, though. This happened many years ago in 2013. I used Facebook quite a bit back then, but I don't really use it at all anymore. On a daily basis, I would use the Facebook app on my phone and had the Messenger app as well. I talked to several of my friends that way, and when this happened, I was about 19 years old. I had probably upwards of 500 friends on there, which is a lot of people, but I've seen accounts with thousands. Anyways, I got a friend request from a girl named Veronica. I saw that we had about 5 mutual friends, and based on her picture, she looked nice. I looked at her profile page, but there wasn't much there. Just her age, which was also 19, and she had 2 pictures, and I saw that she had about 200 friends. After skimming over her page, I didn't actually know who she was, but I accepted the friend request. Our mutual friends were some people who I had gone to high school with, but didn't really know all that well as one other person who I didn't go to high school with, but lived in the general area. Not too long after I accepted her request, she sent me a message. I went to the Messenger app and I started talking with her. She was really cool and we hit it off. We talked for probably about a week before we wanted to meet up. I knew that she lived in the area, but I didn't know exactly where. Veronica suggested that we meet at a local mall, and there was a really popular shopping center about 10 minutes from my house. We decided to meet that Saturday at 11 a.m. In the meantime, we kept talking quite a bit just like usual. When it was Saturday, I drove to the mall and went inside. It was pretty busy with it being a weekend. I had let Veronica know when I was leaving, and I think she left at around the same time as me. When I got inside, I messaged her that I was there, but that's when she stopped replying to me initially. At first, she told me that she was inside the mall and would look for me, but after that, I told her where I was and she didn't go there. I was standing in the food court for like 10 minutes and didn't see any sign of her. I reached out to her again, but did not get a response. I did see that she had seen my message though. When she didn't show up for another 5 minutes, I decided to walk around the mall looking for her. I figured that maybe the signal on her phone was bad or something, or maybe she had put her phone in her pocket with our conversation still open. I was just telling myself things like that, but I started to get a bad feeling. The mall was pretty big. It wasn't like the Mall of America or anything, but it was a decent size, and it did have 2 levels. There were also a lot of people there, so it would be tough, but not impossible to find someone. At one point though, when I was looking around, I did see this one guy who kind of looked like he was staring at me from afar. When I walked all around the mall, I saw the guy again, but he was walking a ways back behind me. I walked around for maybe 20 minutes. I really wanted to meet Veronica, but the more I walked around, the more I felt like she wasn't actually there. Then, finally, I felt my phone vibrate. I looked, and Veronica had sent me a message. She said, "Come to the entrance by the food court." That was the first area that I had been, and I had told her when I was there. I walked back over to it, which took me about 2 or 3 minutes. When I got back there, I looked around. It was still crowded, but I didn't see Veronica. I was a good ways away from the entrance doors, and I started to walk over to them. But that's when I noticed that the same guy that I had seen multiple times before was right there. He was standing right by the entrance and kind of looking around. Then, when he made eye contact with me for a brief moment, he walked behind one of the doors. I started to get suspicious, and I decided that I was just going to leave, but I was going to leave in a different door than that one. I began walking in the opposite direction. When I did, I noticed the guy then start to walk through the food court towards me. I picked up the pace and turned a corner to another hallway. I walked quickly and did make it to the exit. I didn't see the man behind me when I made it there. After that, I walked around the mall on the outside until I made it to the parking lot that I had parked in. Then, I drove home. By the time I was home, I looked and saw that I had a message from Veronica. The message said, "Why didn't you come to the food court entrance like I asked? Why did you just leave?" By this time, I knew that Veronica likely didn't exist, and the one guy that I saw was running the account. I asked her to send me a picture of herself right now. Then, she blocked me. That pretty much confirmed my suspicions. I was disappointed, obviously, but I also felt good that I wasn't a victim to anything further than being catfished. From that point forward, I was much more careful with who I talked to online.
A little while ago, I saw an ad on Facebook Marketplace where a woman claimed to be giving away free gerbils. Apparently, the boy-girl pair she owned had produced a huge litter of little gerbil babies, and since there was way too much for her to handle, she was just going to give them away to a handful of loving homes. The ad didn't include the grim little factoid that the gerbil mom would probably eat her babies if she didn't think she could take care of them, but I figured, so I got in touch. The woman turned out to be a widow who had originally bought the gerbils to keep her company. I did think it was kind of unusual that she didn't just get herself a cat or dog if loneliness was the issue, but hey, different strokes for different folks, right? I'm not one to judge. And she seemed so sweet when I called her to arrange a date and time to go pick up 2 of the gerbils. Needless to say, I did not expect her to be living in the conditions she was, because when me and my dad arrived at her home with a little straw-bedded cage to take the gerbils home in, the whole exchange took a turn for the worse. So we called over at the gerbil lady's place, and at first there was no reply. Then when she finally answers the door, we can see she's in quite a sorry state. One of her eyes is swollen and bloodshot, with some super gross-looking yellow gunk collecting in the corner of the eye. But we remain polite and just ignore it. The last thing me and Dad wanted to do was offend or upset the lady by pointing out what was an already obvious medical condition. But when she invites us inside, we get a clue as to how she got sick in the first place. Her little house reeked like it was the single worst stench that ever graced my nostrils, and there were gerbils everywhere. And I mean everywhere. And much like their owner, they were not in good condition. Just from the gerbils that were skittering around the kitchen, I could see that many of them were missing fur in patches, or had painful-looking growths around their legs or backs. Then when she invited us into her TV room for a cup of tea, we could see it was even worse in there. We had to make up some excuse about how we couldn't stay for long after me and my dad shot each other a telepathic look that basically said a giant nope. And with the amount of gerbil poop that clogged up every little corner and skirting board, it was absolutely no wonder that she had some kind of infection. And when I caught sight of an actual tiny rodent skeleton behind one of her curtains, I went into full improv mode to get us out of there. I turned to my dad, named some piece of important gerbil habitat that we hadn't picked up from the store yet, wink wink, but then agreed that, oh, we can't possibly bring home the gerbils without insert name of doodad here, and we'll have to call by again in a couple of days. I remember us both sitting in the car afterward, just kind of in shock at what we'd just seen. The fact that someone could live like that was just depressing and terrifying to me. She obviously had no one coming to check on her, and anyone who thought it was okay to keep a home like that must have been losing their marbles. It sucked having to make a decision like we did. I felt really mean basically snitching, but we just had to call animal rescue, for her benefit more than anything else. The ASPCA rep we spoke to said that they'd investigate and let us know what their call was going to be, and in the end, they got back in touch, thanking us for the tip. Not only was the gerbil lady now in touch with a local charity that would help check up on her in her twilight years, but her house was considerably cleaner and safer after they've cleared out almost 100 gerbils from her property. They said the situation was so bad that the only thing that kept the infestation from spreading were the neighborhood cats. I did remember seeing a bunch of strays hanging around outside, but I figured it was just because she was the local animal lover who would routinely feed them treats or whatever. Turns out she was breeding treats for them, just not in the way she might like to think. The creepiest thing about it was that, from standing outside her home, you'd never have guessed at the horror show waiting for you on the inside. And the whole thing just reminds me that we don't really know what's going on behind closed doors, even the ones closest to us. Behind the facade of normalcy, we have no idea what our friends and neighbors are up to, or what nightmarish conditions they're living under.
I don't know if you would find this scary, but it's definitely creepy to say the least. This happened back in 2020, right when the pandemic was at its highest, specifically in December. I've just turned 18 years old, and I'm a female. Due to the restrictions of having small parties or no parties at all for the holidays, my parents and I decided to do a car parade. I only invited my closest friends, so it wasn't anything big. My birthday was the day before the car parade, so I posted a selfie on my Snapchat story. I rarely post on it now, since Snapchat is kind of pointless these days. I received many birthday greetings from friends and acquaintances, so I had a really great birthday. Although the next day, I had woke up in the morning and were making meal preparations for the car parade. Instead of having the guests stay over, we decided to make the food and then put them into styrofoam boxes and hand them out. While my parents were getting ready to cook that morning, I had got a text on Snapchat from a guy I've known since my freshman year of high school. To give some background information, he was a junior when I was a freshman. How we knew each other is that he was a teacher's assistant for one of my teachers. I sat in the farthest side of the room, so he was beside me most of the time. Anyways, we had stopped talking ever since that time, and I somehow got his Snapchat. Let's call him Rick for this story. I had opened the Snapchat to see that Rick had greeted me a belated birthday. I didn't think much of it. Just another acquaintance greeting me happy birthday. I told him thank you and went on with my morning. About 1 or 2 minutes later, Rick texted me back. From then on, it had started off as a normal conversation. He asked what I was doing, and I told him that I was preparing for the car parade that I was throwing. I thought that I was going to catch up with him because it had really been a while since we last talked. Primarily because he went off to the military after he graduated high school. Since we texted continuously, I'm not really the type of person who likes to continue the conversation after a certain amount of time, especially if I have rare interest in the person. So my dad and I were getting ready to head out to go get balloons and my birthday cake. I didn't have my license nor my own car at the time, so I couldn't get them myself. While I was waiting for my dad to put his shoes on, Rick continued to text me. I don't really remember what he exactly said or what led up to this moment, but he then said something like,
"Let me snatch you up."
Something around those lines. In my mind, I was like, okay. I thought he was joking, so I replied back with, "Laughing my ass off. You're joking, right?" With a crying laughing face emoji after that. His reply to that made me tense up and very uncomfortable.
"Maybe I wasn't kidding,"
he said. What the f? Now I have anxiety. After reading that comment, it made me start to hyperventilate. I then told him that I have to run some errands and hoping that he'll stop texting me after that. I didn't plan on texting him again for the whole day after that whole conversation. And you know what? Later that evening, after the car parade and blowing out the candles and the cake, that creep texted me again. In the back of my mind, I was like, ugh, why is he texting me again? However, when I had opened the message, I had really cringed so hard.
"Hey cutie, how's it going?"
is what he said. Honestly, that name just makes me cringe and it really makes me uncomfortable, especially coming from a guy that I haven't talked to in a long time. So I replied back with a, "Hey," not wanting to seem rude. He then asked me what I was doing, so I told him that we just finished the car parade. He then said,
"Why don't you let me see you, cutie?"
Oh hell no, he's one of those guys. Right at that moment, I had started to shake. My anxiety started to rise once again. All I felt was nervousness, scared, angry, and guilt at that moment. I'm not that stupid to give in and send a picture of me to him. I replied back with a no with the skull emoji, and he said,
"What? Why not?"
with a sad emoji, trying to make me feel sympathetic and give in. Yeah, right. I replied back with a, "Because I said so." About a minute later, he had sent me a picture. It was a picture of himself holding a finger gun to his head, captioned, "Pew." In my mind, I was like, okay, what do you want me to do about it? Is that pic supposed to make me feel guilty? I just said in the chat a simple LOL and exited out of the app. He then kept begging me to send a picture of me, but instead, I replied with either no or just me trying to dodge the question. My responses were just starting to get more bland. That's not really like me, but that's because he made me highly uncomfortable. Now, you're probably wondering why I didn't just immediately block him. I guess it didn't really cross my mind at the time, because I was just overwhelmed and anxious that I didn't think anything else other than having to deal with him longer. Really dumb on my part. Anyways, I didn't tell my parents nor any of my friends while I was having the conversation with them. However, our conversation finally ended after I finally told him how uncomfortable I felt when I was talking to him. To be honest, I'm not usually that straightforward with others, because again, I get really anxious, and I also tend to overthink way too many things. When I told him that, he finally got the idea. Dumbass should have gotten the idea when I said no in the first place. Since then, the conversation died down, and the next day I just blocked him. For the next few days to a week, I couldn't stop thinking back to that conversation. What made me heavily think about it is the fact that he texted me out of nowhere when he saw I just turned 18. Isn't that a coincidence? A guy that I've known since freshman year and has never spoken a word to me for 2 to 4 years, all of a sudden tries to flirt me up after I've turned 18. Yeah, it should be quite obvious. I never thought I would have to deal with a situation like this because I'm a really reserved person as well. So I try to avoid the situations as much as possible, but apparently that didn't happen. To all of you out there, please be aware of these signs and just instantly block the person. Don't deal with them any longer. Don't do the same shit that I did. Just block them from the start when you start to get the uncomfortable vibe from them. This was a few years ago. I was about 18 or 19 and I had been single for a good while focusing on work and school. One day, I was at one of my really good friend's house. We'll call her Blue. I was at her house for a family barbecue. She was talking about this online friend she had, and she had showed me a picture, then telling me, "This is Ryan." She told me how they met, and he was 24. The age gap didn't really bother me, as she said he was just a friend, and Blue usually never met up with people she met online. I told her he seemed nice, and after a while, we had sat in her room, and she was on FaceTime with him. I was doodling in my notebook, and we had been dressed fairly nicely for the barbecue, so my hair and makeup were done. Anyway, at some point, Blue turns her phone, and she has Ryan say hi to me. I looked up from my notebook, and I waved, giving a small smile. I've never really been a sociable person. After a while of them talking, they had ended their chat, and Blue had looked at me, smiling like a devil. "The fuck did I do?" I asked her, and just as I had, my phone vibrated. I looked at my phone, then at her. I slowly flipped it over, and on my notification bar was my Snapchat. "So-and-so has added you." I opened it and saw a chat, and it read, "Hey, don't be mad at Blue, but I thought you were really pretty with your glasses and the way your hair looked. So I asked her to give me your snap." I felt my face then blush, as I don't really handle compliments well. Blue started laughing, and she said, "Come on, say something to him." I thought it was a bit weird that as her own online friend, he would ask for my snap. But nonetheless, being naive and trying to be nice, I responded. Ryan was nice, but something felt off during our conversation. When we talked about where we lived, I told him I lived in San Jose, and he said he lived in Livermore. Now, for those of you who don't know, they're about a 1-hour drive from each other, and at the time, my parents wouldn't let me drive that far. So for our first date, after much back and forth, we had planned to meet in Pleasanton, which is about 45 minutes. I hadn't taken into account the amount of freeway I'd have to drive, and Ryan said he couldn't make the drive because his mother had his car. Halfway there though, I got really anxious, and I had to call Blue because my GPS had been driving through the woods to get around the traffic. When I finally got to the destination, Ryan had arrived a few minutes before me. I got out, and I apologized for my arrival. He said it was no problem. We went in, and we proceeded to play some mini golf. After the sun went down, I checked the time, and I realized if I were to get home before curfew, I'd have to leave really soon. I had told Ryan that I had a curfew and just how strict my parents were beforehand. When I told him I had to leave, his emotion changed. He went from joking and polite to serious and annoyed. He kept asking and bugging me to stay even longer. Would it really be so bad if you stayed? Just a bit longer. Can't we finish first? I kept trying to let him down easy, but I eventually gave him a really firm no. We returned to the golf clubs, and I walked to the cars. Even though I was now feeling a bit off, when he leaned in, I gave him a small hug. But I wasn't ready when he pulled me in and landed a kiss right on my lips. I pulled back and said goodnight, jumped in my car, and then left. I called Blue and ranted to her about the whole thing. She tried to calm me down about the whole thing, saying it was just first date jitters and being out of the game. As I got close to home, we hung up and I tried to let it go. A few days later, I was at work, and during some dead time, I was on my phone chatting with Blue and Ryan individually. Ryan wanted to meet up again, and I was okay with it. He seemed a bit pushy, but I paid it no mind. However, I probably should have blocked him. When it came to the day for us to hang out, I was at work and my shift was almost over. Now, my work is only 5 to 10 minutes away from where I live, and I had never given Ryan my exact address or had it available on Snap. Anyways, when it came to the day of our planned meetup, we were supposed to meet up on the fringe of San Jose because I still didn't want him knowing where I lived. I had told Blue and she knew the whole plan. When it came to the day of, I was a few minutes away from getting off work and Ryan texted me on Snap. He said that he needed a rain check. I asked if everything was okay, but he said that everything was fine and that his mom just didn't want him driving all the way over here. I said no worries, but was a bit irked. As I had defied my strict parents, I lied to them and drove all the way out there to see him, but I guess I could chalk that up to childhood differences. After all that, the irk feeling passed relatively quickly. I left the chat and I had messaged my cousin Benny and my other friend Rez. I told them that my date rain checked and that we should have a movie night. They both replied yes, and after I texted my parents, I had put down my phone and did some quick cleaning. After I clocked out, I had sat in my car and checked some of the messages I had. Ryan had messaged me saying something along the lines of, "Oh hey, never mind, I can come down." And I'd responded back telling him, "Oh sorry, after you rain checked, I texted my younger cousin and we made plans." He immediately seemed angry. He wanted me to cancel and we got into a small fight. He kept saying that I should cancel on my cousin, who's honestly like a little sister to me. When I told him no, he canceled first and we can just reschedule. He wouldn't have it. He eventually turned to Blue and started ranting to her. I turned off my phone and just went to pick up my cousin. We had our movie night and it was fun. But the next day, after I took my cousin home, I looked at my phone and saw a shitload of messages from Ryan. The last one terrified me. He said he was on his way to see me. I called Blue and my tone was angry, irritated. I wasn't taking any shit. I asked straight away if she gave my address to Ryan. She stopped and said no. She got the hint and she asked what happened. I told her that he said he was on his way, that he was driving somewhere into San Jose, which admittedly is a big city. She said that she didn't give it to him and that she could reach out to him to see what was going on. She never got back to me, and to clarify, she really never did give him my address, but I just got on with my day. I was due to dog sit my Nana's elderly dog. He was a small dog, blind, and pretty deaf. I carried him in the kitchen as any mess would be really easy to clean from the tile. One of my good friends Sal joined me at my house and we joked about watching movies. About an hour into watching Curly the dog, I got a call. It was Ryan. He said he was at Bogany Park and he was 3 blocks away from my house. I muted my call and I looked at Sal. She asked if I was okay and I put my shoes on. I asked him when he got there. He said he'd been there just 5 minutes. As we'd met before, he'd seen my car before and I was hoping he'd just drive straight through the park and not weave through the neighborhood. I checked on Curly quickly and then Sal and I took off to the park. I walked the long way to approach from the opposite side of the park from where my house would be, and I saw him. He was just standing there doing backflips and looking around. Sal and I looked at each other, and we approached him slowly. He seemed like he was in a good mood, but I was still on edge. "Hey, so why this park?" was all I said. "Well, you said the drive to Pleasanton was too far, so I thought I'd come to you." I took a moment and I figured that I didn't really want to know how he knew where I lived, so I just shut him down. "Listen, you're sweet, and thank you for coming out this way to, I don't know, say hi, I guess, but this is a bit too much for me." He seemed really unfazed by what I had said, and he told me he drove all the way down here so we could hang out. I told him that if he had messaged me beforehand, I would have told him I'd be busy today. I was dog sitting, and I wouldn't be able to. He said that we could just hang out here, and that I could bring the dog, and that we can just chill here. I told him that wasn't a good idea, and the dog wasn't friendly. He offered for us to get into his car so he could drive us, or at least meet at my place. I knew that there was no more letting him down gently. I looked at him and said, "Look, you drove here some blocks from where I live. I don't know how you found this park, but I'm not interested. The weird kiss, the pushiness, I'm not into it. I'm not gonna get into your car. This is done. Go ahead, complain to Blue or whatever. You're giving me the creeps." At this point, I knew that my temper got the best of me. Sal had gotten into the conversation, and she then pulled me away for us to walk back the way we came. Another adult, a father to one of the kids at the playground, had taken notice of this, and he stopped him from following us. When I finally got home, I locked all of the doors and I blocked him on Snap and deleted his number. I gave Blue a call and I told her what happened. She calmed me down a bit and she told me she was going to block him too. It's now been 3 or 4 years, and I still remember how he tried to turn the whole thing on me. How he had called Blue and she just played along with it before hanging up and blocking him. We still don't know how he got so close to my house. After that, no matter how much I wanted to rebel against my parents, I was always very cautious when it came to dating.
For a while, when I was 16, I was always on Snapchat. I was on there so much it was pretty normal for me to get follows from odd people. People I'd never met, but never like this. It was June 18th of 2015. I was on Snapchat doing what I always do. Everything was pretty normal. Like always, I was scrolling through all my followers, and I came across a username that said, "Look outside your window." It sent chills down my spine. It was also kind of alarming, mainly because seconds later, I heard what sounded like a rock hitting my window. Startled, I tried to shake it off and get back to what I was doing. I began to receive chats from this follower on a regular basis, but I would never respond. I simply didn't know who they were, and they had a creepy enough username. One day he sent me a picture. It was from the outside of someone's house, outside of a window, and it read, "Look familiar?" Instantly I stood up, because that was a window on our house, specifically to my bedroom. I turned slowly to the window, expecting to see someone there. I'd never felt my heart pound so hard before. But when I gazed out the window, I could see no one. I watched out the window for a while, expecting to see someone come out of hiding, but there was no one there. Maybe, I thought, this was just from a house similar to ours. I closed the curtain, and I decided to check the doors before crawling up onto the couch and watching TV. As I sat down, though, I got another message on Snapchat. It was from the same person. I don't know why I opened it. I should have just ignored them from then on. This one read, "You look surprised." It showed a picture of the same window, but from further away. The window now had the curtains drawn, the same curtains I use in my bedroom. That was it. I called my mom. I was crying as I tried to explain to her what was happening. I told her she needed to come home right away. I don't think she fully understood. She sounded irritated and confused, but she knew that this was urgent, so thankfully, she came home early. She took my phone and went through my Snapchat stuff. And right before she could decide what to do, I got a message on my Snapchat again. Immediately, my mother read it. There was no picture this time. It just said, "Do you want me to hurt your mother too?" This was enough to freak me out and get my mom pissed. She ended up reporting it, though there wasn't much to go on. The police would drive by our house every so often for the next few days. It was hard to sleep during that time. Even with the police there, I didn't feel safe. Mom even took some more time off to be with me more often. And luckily, after all of this, I haven't received any more messages or pictures. So long, look outside your window, and I hope I never hear from you again. First of all, I just want to say that if you don't explicitly know someone in real life, do not add them as a friend on any sort of social media. It could either be spam or someone trying to do something terrible to you. Anyway, this year I'd finally gotten on Snapchat. My friends had pressured me to get on it, although I didn't really want to. I just wasn't into the idea of sending or receiving pictures and videos of myself or other people. I'm not the best at presenting myself or the things in my life, and I usually wasn't interested in other people's lives. I was an introvert by definition. Even though I didn't expect it, I was growing kind of fond of the app after using it for a few weeks. I began taking more and more selfies. I think it was helping me not care too much about my appearance or what strangers thought of me. It was really helping me come out of my shell, and I was having a good time. That was until I made a huge screw up. I was fooling around, checking out posts from those I follow, thinking of what I could post next, when I came by a message at the top of my iPhone. It said, "Hannah28 has added you." I quickly rattled my brain, trying to think of someone I knew who was named Hannah, but I couldn't think of anyone. I didn't mind much though, because Hannah28 was a girl, and I loved getting attention from girls. So I checked out her profile and liked what I saw, and I decided to add her as well. And only seconds after, I got a message from her. "Hey you," she said. I replied, "Oh hi, do I know you?" "No," she says. I then proceeded to ask her how old she was. She said 15, which was my age, and this made me smile. And before I could reply to that, she sent me an even better message, saying, "I think you're cute." I smiled even bigger now, until I realized that I haven't posted anything recently, so there was nothing of me on my profile at the moment, and I never sent her any photos. So how could she know what I looked like? I didn't answer. I mean, what should I have answered? I was nervous and confused. I've always been a paranoid person when it comes to who I'm talking to, and especially when it comes to girls. I then received 2 more messages. I didn't dare open them. I was already pretty flustered, and it was getting late, so I headed off to bed. I woke up in the morning to the sound of my phone buzzing repeatedly. It was Hannah28 again. She was blowing up my Snapchat, sending me video after video with no explanation. So, being both curious and weirded out, there was only one thing I could do. I began to play each video. All of these videos were at night. I could barely see anything in most of them. In the first one, she seemed to be walking down a street. She was saying something in a whisper. It wasn't in English, and I didn't know what she was saying. In the second video, her voice was more clear. I could tell she was speaking Spanish. She was still on the street she was walking. It was too dark to make out any details. And finally, in the third video, she was standing on someone's porch, and she was wiggling a very familiar doorknob. The door was locked, and she couldn't get inside, so she filmed herself scratching the wood of the door with her fingernails that were especially long. At this point, I was in denial. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, what I was hearing. I did my best to listen to what she was saying in Spanish as she wiggled the doorknob. I went over to Google Translate and typed in what I'd heard, and I got a rough yet accurate enough translation. And then I knew exactly what she had been repeating in every single video. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." You see, the door she was at was my door. She had come to my house. She had tried to get inside. This creepy stranger was only a few meters away from me at one point. while I was unconscious in bed. My heart pounded like it was going to explode. Right away, I went on my Snapchat and blocked this crazy person, and I tried to forget everything that had happened. But when I saw the scratching at the door, I couldn't help but tell my parents. Unfortunately, I had gotten rid of any trace of Hannah28 on Snapchat, so I was unable to show them what I was talking about. At the very most, they thought it was weird, because I had no evidence to back up what I was saying. If only I'd kept those videos, I could have told my parents to call the cops. Well, my week went by without any more weird happenings, and I couldn't be happier. But just a few weeks ago, I got a new notification on my Snapchat account, and I'm sure you can guess what it said. Hannah29 has added you. My friend has always had experiences with strange or paranormal happenings ever since she was born, so this kind of stuff isn't uncommon for her, but it's still pretty scary. One day, my friend had friends over at her house. I should mention it's a big deal because they don't like coming over, because the house is unsettling to them. I can't say I blame them. Well, when they got there, they were having a good time, and at one point she was doing a silly Snapchat with her friends. And of course, that's when things got weird. She decided to play back the video to watch it, when she heard a deep voice in the playback say,
Get out.
After they heard that, she and her friends were so creeped out that they exited the house. She decided to go ahead and post it to her Snapchat to see if anyone who listened to it could hear it as well. And apparently they could. She was glad she wasn't the only one, but she was still having a panic attack about it. She must have been some miracle worker, because she convinced her friends to stay and to just try to forget about it. And for a while it worked, until they fell asleep. It didn't last long before they all shot up at the same time, and they all began to freak out simultaneously. Once they calmed down and could actually breathe, my friend asked them if they had seen it too, because apparently they had all seen an old man. He walked into the room after slowly opening the bedroom door and yelled at them in an earth-shaking voice to get out of his house. Needless to say, she had to wake up her mom to call the other friend's parents. They didn't want to stay there any longer. By 2 in the morning, they were gone, but her mom thankfully believed her stories, especially after she showed the video to her. To this day, myself including, nobody at school goes near her house. The stories have spread since then, and everyone knows not to go there or to even get close, because at her house, you're never alone.
On May 18th of 1935, George and Laura Lorius joined their friends Albert and Tilly Haberer on the cross-country road trip of a lifetime. From their home in southern Illinois, the group planned on driving across 2,000 miles of plains and desert, before finally finishing up on the coast of California, and by May 21st, they had arrived in the small town of Vaughn, New Mexico. After piling out of George Lorius's Nash sedan, the two couples checked into the Vaughn Hotel before sending off several postcards to friends and family. Then, after a small dinner at a local diner, the group retired to their rooms for the night before continuing west the following morning. In their postcards, the group seemed to be in high spirits and reported nothing untoward occurring during their most recent drive. But after the couples continued driving west on the morning of the 22nd, neither was ever heard from again. The morning of May 26th that the Lorius' car was found abandoned in the business district of Dallas, Texas. The vehicle's keys were still in the ignition, the gas tank was full, and numerous postcards lay in the passenger seat. But there was no sign of any of the Illinois road trippers. Gas station receipts confirmed that Mr. Lorius had purchased fuel in a place called Socorro on May 23rd, but after that, their fate was anyone's guess. The following week, the couple's families were notified of their disappearance, and an official investigation was launched. Police initially believed that the absence of $400 worth of traveler's checks indicated that a violent robbery had taken place. However, investigators soon discovered that the couple's car had been involved in a minor accident shortly after arriving in Socorro. Since the accident could have angered someone enough to do harm to the road trippers, police began questioning the handful of witnesses to the crash. Yet instead of describing the vehicle as containing two middle-aged couples, witnesses stated that the lone occupant was a young man with dark-colored hair. Detectives managed to track the vehicle from the scene of the accident to a small local repair shop. Mechanics changed a tire on the vehicle and completed other minor repairs. Then whoever was driving the car paid with one of George Lorius's traveler's checks. Detectives then followed the trail of cash checks to a motel in El Paso, and then to Dallas, which is where the vehicle was found abandoned on May 26th. The investigation briefly stalled until June 29th, when a report came in of a small desert bushfire on the outskirts of Albuquerque. The fire department arrived to discover a piece of burning luggage. Inside were the smoldering belongings of George and Laura Lorius. With the man responsible for the couple's disappearance still actively disposing of their belongings, law enforcement rushed into action in the hopes they might still be recovered alive. The FBI headed up a multi-agency task force which searched rivers, lakes, mine shafts, wells, and numerous spots around the desert. Yet despite the vast reach of the well-staffed search teams, not a trace of the missing couples could be found. Unable to apprehend a suspect, detectives found themselves diverted to other investigations, and the case eventually went cold. But as recently as 2010, the case files are still revisited by various state police officers, each hoping for a flash of inspiration. According to one such officer, Agent Norman Rhodes, the case has never been officially closed, but the low probability of it being solved means that the New Mexico State Police can rarely afford to pay it any mind. Yet despite the perceived difficulties of the case, Agent Rhodes has since made it his personal mission to discover what happened to the 4 Illinois road trippers. Rhodes stated that perhaps his most daunting task has been trying to locate the remains of the road trippers' bodies, which are most likely nothing more than desiccated bones today. It will also be no small feat to locate the couple's killer, who will have probably died of old age since the crime took place, but such a prospect hasn't seemed to have deterred Agent Rhodes. Perhaps his zeal comes from the ongoing support and assistance provided by Laura Lorius's great-niece, Barbara Ashcraft, who is desperate to see the family mystery finally solved. When pressed on what her theories regarding his relative's fate, Ashcraft believes they were murdered in Vaughn, possibly in the very same cafe that they had their breakfast in on the morning of their disappearance. The purpose of their stop in Vaughn was so that the Loriuses could visit an old friend who just so happened to live there, but it's unclear whether or not this friend actually met with them. Not only that, but in 1963, a private investigator named Walter Duke received a letter from a woman claiming to have witnessed the murders. The woman said she watched the two couples being escorted into the basement of a cafe, and that she had later heard that they'd been robbed, murdered, and then buried in wet concrete. The tip has led Barbara Ashcraft to suggest that the investigation should focus on the concrete slabs lining the site of the former Vaughn Hotel, but Agent Norman Rhodes has another theory. After combing over stacks of reports in the State Police Records Division, Rhodes has created a timeline of events and interviews that's an incredible 141 pages long. According to him, 2 postcards in particular have convinced Rhodes that the couples actually left Vaughn on the morning of May 22nd with the intention of driving to Albuquerque via Santa Fe. A postcard marked May 22nd was mailed to Albuquerque, and a clerk at Albuquerque's Sturgis Hotel told investigators that the couples visited her hotel that afternoon to ask about renting rooms. Agent Rhodes believed that the couples rented one of the smaller rooms at this hotel so that each of them could take a shower, and intended to travel over to Gallup by nightfall. Yet shortly after leaving town, they suffered their run-in with their mysterious killer. It's very possible that the couples misjudged the distance to Albuquerque and had ended up driving around in the dark when it's much harder to properly navigate. Rhodes believed that this is how they became vulnerable to a potential predator, and that the couple simply misplaced their trust in someone who brutally and violently betrayed them. Although spotted by a handful of witnesses, the police are no closer to identifying the man who took George Lorius's car as they were almost 90 years ago. But even if this person was identified, they're probably in no fit state to answer questions about something that occurred back in 1935, and it's unlikely that there's any surviving forensic evidence. The truth behind the disappearance of George Lorius, Laura Lorius, and their friends Albert and Tilly might well have vanished along with them, and the mystery of how 4 regular, wholesome people simply disappeared one day is unlikely to ever be unraveled. Back in my early 20s, me and my bestie went through a phase of going on road trips every other weekend, and this one time, we planned on driving all the way to San Francisco with a few stops in between. So first day, we're about 4 hours into the drive and we're going along I-70 in Colorado, coming up on the state line. Around 8 p.m., we pull over at a gas station, and while I'm fueling up, I notice these other 2 girls pumping gas. They looked around the same age as us, like they could have been on a road trip just like we were, but just behind them, at the other pump, was this guy. He looked like he was in his late 30s or early 40s, and the girls can't see him doing it, but he's just staring at these 2 girls with a blank expression on his face, eyes darting back and forth between them as they pumped their gas. It was really creepy, but after a while, the guy went back to seeing to his car, and I went inside of the gas station to grab some snacks as fuel for our night drive up to Salt Lake City. When I walk back out of the gas station, the girls are just leaving in their car, and when I take a look around for the creepy truck guy, he's staring at their car again. Then, in a move that seemed so full of bad intention that it actually freaked me out, he suddenly jumped in his truck, then went speeding off in the same direction as the girls did. I'm like, no. If that happened to me and my friend, I'd want someone to have our back too, even if it was just to trail us while dialing 911 or whatever. By the time I caught up with them, the guy was riding their butt with his high beams on, flashing his lights every so often like he was trying to get them to pull over or something. Then right there in front of me, the guy speeds up around the side of the girl's car. Then I can see him leaning over in his seat so he can shout stuff over to them. The next thing I know, the girl's car starts to pull over and I'm thinking, oh God, no, don't do it. But the guy in the truck just passes them and keeps going, maybe because he saw me in his rear view and knew that he couldn't do anything with witnesses. Then me and my friend also pull over right up behind where the girls are parked, and after putting my hazard lights on, we got out to see if they were okay, and they were not okay. The guy was so obviously not a cop, but apparently he'd been yelling at the girls that he was a deputy and that if they didn't pull over, they'd be going to jail. That was when they decided to actually do as he was asking, and if they pulled over without us being behind them, there's no telling what would have happened that night. I think it says everything that the guy just fled once we realized that they weren't alone. He must have known that his little cop impersonation wouldn't have stood up to scrutiny, but then he obviously wasn't planning on keeping his little charade up if he actually got the girls to pull over. If he'd have gotten his hands on them, they would have been in a whole world of hurt. We told the girls that they were welcome to stick behind us until we reached the next gas station or any place they could stop and link up with the cops to tell them what happened. They took us up on the offer and we parted ways not long after, but not after some very grateful hugs. Stuff like that made me wonder just how safe me and my friend were. Someone else had gotten unlucky that time, but how long would it be until it was us that had attracted the attention of some highway psycho? We tried to cut down on the amount of time we spent driving at night after that. It always made it much easier to get around, what with the roads being less busy, but I think we can all agree that there's something about the darkness that makes creeps feel more comfortable being creeps. There's a wilder point in there too, and it's something that'll always scare me as a young woman. We can take all the safety precautions we want, go on as many take back the night marches as we can organize. Heck, we can go ahead and carry a gun if we're so inclined, but we'll never be able to stop people wanting to hurt other people. Some are born that way, some are made that way, and sometimes, when they really want to inflict pain or misery, there's really nothing anyone can do about it.
Over the 10 years that I have been driving shipments across the country, I've seen a lot of things. Some of them were truly beautiful sights, while others might end up haunting you for the rest of your life. For instance, you never really know what to expect when you enter a truck stop or gas station bathroom. On a good day, the restroom might be recently cleaned out and is entirely empty aside from you, but on a bad day, let's just say they can get pretty bad. I'll never forget the time that I was driving through Louisiana, making my way to Florida to drop off a shipment. At the time, I had been doing a lot of overnight driving and sleeping during the daytime. It was a really efficient method for a while because of how empty the roads were after midnight. I never really had to worry about a traffic jam. My biggest issue on those night drives was either one or two things. One, where am I going to stop for food? After 11 p.m. it becomes increasingly harder to find a fast food place that's open. And the second issue was often the more serious of the two. Where can I find a good place to use the bathroom? That night, I was mainly dealing with the second problem. And at this point, it was around 1 in the morning. And it started looking like I was going to have to pull off on the side of the road and run into the woods to use the bathroom really fast. But luckily, I was saved by a sign. The sign pointed out that there was a Shell gas station half a mile down the road. And according to the sign, it also had a truck stop attached to it, which told me that there was a restroom there. I continued to make my way down the road toward the gas station. And when I finally made it there, I was surprised. Most of the Shell stations that I would stop at were larger than most gas stations, especially if they supposedly had a truck stop attached to them. But not this time. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw one of the smallest, poorly lit gas stations I had ever seen. And after taking a second look, I could tell that this gas station had been abandoned for at least a year or two. I thought about continuing on down the street, but I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I parked the truck off to the side of the parking lot and got ready to hop down from my seat when I hesitated. Something struck me as odd about this gas station. Aside from the fact that it looked like there was no one around for miles, there was also this strange, distinct smell in the air. All I could do was pray that it wasn't coming from the restrooms. I continued to get out of my truck and locked the door behind me as I made my way toward the gas station. And as I got closer to the building, I kept my eyes glued to the floor to make sure I didn't step in anything. That was when I noticed a slight discoloration in the pavement. Most of the ground was a dull, dark gray color, but there was a section of the parking lot that looked like there had been some sort of oil spill or something. I just walked right past it and made my way around the back of the gas station in hopes that the restrooms were still unlocked. When I got to the restroom door, I couldn't help but notice more markings on the ground that looked like the same stain that was in front of the store. Once again, I ignored it though and began to open the restroom door. That was when it hit me. As soon as I opened the door, a scent came pouring out of the bathroom that sent me practically stumbling backward. Gagging from how horrible the stench was, I knew that I still needed to go, whether it was disgusting or not. So I took my bandana that I always kept in my back pocket and wrapped it around my face to try to help the smell. I took a deep breath before opening the door again and tried to be as quick as possible with getting in and out of the restroom. And as soon as I stepped inside, I realized what it was that I was smelling. Laying in the center of the bathroom floor was the body of a man who appeared to have been dead for quite some time. As soon as I saw the body and realized that the horrible stench was the smell of a decomposing corpse, I ran out of the bathroom as fast as I could and began throwing up. I quickly made my way back to my truck and began calling the police, who came and examined the body. After giving them my statement, I was able to be on my way, which was good because I couldn't be late with my shipment. But as quick of an experience as that was, I will never forget that horrible smell. When I first got into truck driving as a career, my father used to tell me about these stories about guys that he knew that used to drive big rigs. According to him, a lot of them used to have firearms with them in their trucks to keep them safe while they were out on the road. Nowadays, though, at least for the company that I work for, you're not allowed to carry weapons in your truck because if someone got hurt, it would end up being the company that got into trouble. That being said, I can understand why drivers feel like they need something to protect themselves. You never know what sort of situation you might find yourself in. I learned the hard way that you never know what to expect when it comes to being out on the road. It all went down when I was out delivering a shipment for a Kohl's distribution center that had me driving through Illinois. I found myself passing through the Chicago area, and by the time the traffic had dialed itself down a lot, it was probably around 9:30 at night when I found myself being rerouted by the truck's GPS. Apparently, a road had been closed up ahead, so I had to take a short detour. The GPS said that it was only supposed to tack on an extra 35 minutes to my trip, but along the way, things got really hairy. As I was making my way through the new route, I couldn't help but notice it was taking me through a residential neighborhood. Now, it was dark out, so I couldn't quite tell, but from the looks of things, it was like I was driving through a ghost town. Hardly any of the homes that I slowly passed by appeared to have anyone living in them, and many looked like they were in the process of being demolished. For a minute, it was like there was no life around me. That changed the second I turned a corner onto a different block. There were only a few people outside, but I could see a group of friends hanging out on the sidewalk in front of one of the houses. It was nothing too out of the ordinary, so I just continued to drive. However, I would learn that those kids that I saw hanging out were actually lookouts for some of the local gang members in the area. I only found this out when I ended up filing a police report about what happened next. As I continued driving, I started to notice what looked like taillights up ahead, which I assumed was just someone that had stopped at an intersection. However, as I approached the vehicle, I began to notice some things that made me feel a bit uneasy. I noticed that there were multiple men with their hoods up standing on either side of the street, and to make matters worse, as soon as I passed one of the cars that had been parked on the side of the road, it started up and pulled out right behind me. I was blocked in. I brought the truck to a stop behind the car that was sitting at the intersection, and within a matter of seconds, I had people at both of the doors of my truck, one of which was pointing a handgun of sorts through the driver's side window, right at my head. I lifted my hands off the steering wheel as one of the men began to order me to get out of the truck. I didn't question him at all and began unbuckling my seatbelt and hopping out of the vehicle. As the man continued to point his gun at me, I saw another hop into the truck and get into the driver's seat. All of the vehicles, including my truck, pulled away from the scene, and I was left there surrounded by 5 men, all grasping their firearms tightly. I thought I was done for. I couldn't even begin to figure out a way for me to make it out of this situation. But to my surprise, they took my wallet and cell phone and then sent me walking in the direction that I had come in. With every step away from them that I took, I was worried that I might hear the sound of gunshots. But thankfully, all I could hear was the sound of the men getting into the other cars that had been parked on the side of the road and then driving away. I made my way to the nearest police station and reported the incident. And honestly, the officers didn't look surprised. I guess carjackings are a normal thing in that area. All in all, they never found the merchandise that was taken. But thankfully, I managed not only to keep my life, but also my job. Do you remember that show, Ice Road Truckers? I used to love that show, especially as a driver myself. Now, I was never in a scenario where I had to drive my massive rig over a frozen lake or anything like that, but I will tell you right now that an icy road can be a death trap for anyone in a truck. It only takes one little slip and you can end your life or the life of somebody else. Driving in the winter is a truly terrifying thing in some states, and I will never forget the time that I almost lost my life on the road that I must have driven down almost 100 times. It was back when I used to drive trucks for a local company, which meant that I was typically only ever driving from the distribution center to the stores in my area. And it was a great gig. I mean, it's one of the few times as a trucker that I actually got to spend almost every night with my family. It also meant that I was driving the same route over and over again. And after a while, they sort of became like second nature. That is until winter hit. This year was projected to be a particularly cold one, and almost every day there was warnings about black ice accumulating on the roadways. So I knew that now, more than any other time in the year, I had to be vigilant and pay attention to the street in front of me. That being said, you can do everything right and still end up slipping. On the day of my accident, everything started out just fine. I knew the roads had the potential to be bad, so I made sure to prepare myself and drive a bit slower than usual, especially when I made it onto one of the main roads in our area known as Crawford Street. Crawford was a very scenic mountain road that was absolutely beautiful to drive down under the right conditions. However, due to how windy the road was, I knew that it was going to be a problem for me that day. As soon as I made it onto Crawford, I could see the patches of ice lining the shoulders, and right away I began slowing down and driving very carefully. I must have made it about halfway down the road without an incident before I felt it. More than one of the tires on my passenger side must have touched the ice because I could feel them sliding. Out of nowhere, I felt the steering wheel begin to pull to the right as I continued going down the road. I tried to correct it, but that, coupled with more than one of my tires being unable to grip the road, my truck began to fishtail. I tried not to panic, but there was nothing I could do as I began barreling toward the guardrail on the side of the road, knowing full well that there was no way that I would be able to stop my truck from going off the side of the hill. As soon as my truck broke through the rail, I felt it pull to the side as the trailer hooked to the back began to roll down the hill, taking the cab and myself down with it. I had been buckled in, and the hill wasn't too large, so the truck only rolled about 1.5 times. Thankfully, my only injury came from the shards of broken glass from all the windows shattering around me. It left me with a few lacerations, but when the truck finally came to a stop, I was able to unbuckle myself and crawl out of the cab before anything serious happened. I looked up to the section of the guardrail that I had torn through and was simply happy to be alive. I will never forget the feeling of being flipped around as the truck began rolling down the hill, and driving through the wintry road will be forever something that puts me on edge.
In 2018, I broke up with my boyfriend and was nearly homeless. I moved across the country with him, and as life sometimes happens, it didn't work out. Unfortunately, I didn't know anyone where I was, and I had nowhere to go. I was living out of my car for a couple of days until I found a beautiful little apartment complex that was accepting new tenants. I went in and pleaded my case to the management team there, and thankfully they pulled some strings and got me in right away. I didn't have much to move in at first, since most of the stuff I left at my last place. As I slowly started to gather furniture, the place started to feel like a home. My cute little one-bedroom studio apartment became my pride and joy. It didn't take long for my ex-boyfriend to find where I was, and I kid you not, he would drop off boxes full of my stuff and leave it on the front steps of the apartment building. A real classy boy, that one. The apartments I was living in offered garages for your car or storage. Most of the tenants used it for storage. The only thing that wasn't ideal was that you were sharing the garage with another random tenant, and they weren't sorted out by the building or apartment number, but basically by whatever one was available. I got a garage unit that thankfully wasn't that far of a walk from my apartment. They had one left, and I felt incredibly lucky. When I made my way to the garage and opened it up, I was surprised to see an older man sitting in there just rocking in a chair. He was angry as soon as I opened the door, and he shouted, "Hey, get out of here, this is my garage." I was a bit uncomfortable, but I always stand my ground. In a very polite voice, I responded to the man, "I'm sorry, sir, but I just purchased the other half of this garage for my storage. I'm sorry, but you'll have to share now." The man didn't like this. He got up out of his chair and made his way to the door, and he started shouting, "Well, I don't think so." The man literally started to grab my boxes and throw them back into the parking lot. As I stood there, blown away by the antics of this man, he continued to complain.
I pay for this space, it's mine. Get your crap out of there.
Not wanting to escalate this anymore, I went back to the office and told the woman in charge that the old guy wouldn't let me in the garage. She looked annoyed as if this had been a problem before, and she went down there and laid down the law with this older guy. They went back and forth, but ultimately it ended with the guy moving his stuff to his side of the line. Yes, there was a literal line in the middle of the garage separating the two sides for each tenant. I brought my stuff in there as quickly as I could because I wanted nothing to do with this guy. He grumbled to himself the entire time I brought my stuff over, and I just ignored him. The next couple of days, I had a bad feeling about my stuff. I didn't have anything insanely valuable in there, but most of the stuff in those boxes were personal belongings or sentimental to me in some way. One night, early in the evening, I decided to go check on my stuff, and I couldn't believe what I saw. The man sitting in his chair, rocking back and forth and wearing one of my scarves. I started to yell at the guy, and he responded,
This is my scarf, little lady.
And that's when I noticed that he had gone through all of my boxes and thrown my belongings all over the garage. Clothes, paperwork, furniture, everything on my side were thrown all over the place. I called him out on it, and he became incredibly hostile and said,
I didn't touch your stuff. Now you relax.
I went back to the management of the apartments and told them everything. She approached the man and they went at it again. The old man denied touching my stuff and claimed that it was like that when he came into the garage. I didn't buy it, and neither did the manager. I believe she threatened to evict the guy and told him that he could no longer have access to the garage. He had 2 days to get all of his belongings out of there. The man was upset and screaming. I almost felt bad for him until I remembered all of my stuff on the ground. The man left the garage enraged. I could hear him screaming all the way through the parking lot. When he was gone, I closed the door and started to pick up my belongings. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started to glance at his side. This guy had a ton of interesting stuff when I stopped to look at his side. It wasn't just junk and clutter, but really unbelievable antiques. He had stuff from old wars, old movie posters, books, and anything cool you can think of. It was like a vault of treasure. I continued to put my stuff away, and that's when I noticed my scarf. He was right. The scarf he was wearing was, in fact, his scarf. I felt horrible and thought I owed the guy an apology. I even decided to myself that if I don't see him within the next 2 days, I'll tell the manager that he can store his stuff in my garage. I just don't want him in there unless I'm there. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens outside. I looked out from my balcony and I could see that the sirens were outside of my garage. I ran down there and I couldn't believe my eyes. The older man looked like he had been hit by a bus, but was standing up talking to the police and the manager of the apartments. I looked back at the car, and it was insane. It was my ex-boyfriend. I ran over to the police and asked what was going on, and basically my ex had been breaking into my garage unit and going through all my stuff, basically just trying to make my life a nightmare. He wasn't trying to rob or steal anything. The old man knew that he was innocent and went down to the garage and waited all night for something to happen. Around 5 a.m., my ex started breaking in, and once he went over to my boxes and threw stuff around, the old man confronted him. A brief fight ensued, and the old guy was like some decorated war hero, and even at his advanced age, he was able to take down my ex. I thanked the man and tried to give him something, but he just wanted his garage back. I'm so thankful that this man cared enough about his stuff that he waited all night to prove that he was innocent. And thankfully, he stopped him when he did because I don't know how far my ex would have gone or what he was capable of. I fed the old man leftovers for the year that I lived in that apartment, and I have since moved home with my parents. Don't judge a book by its cover because sometimes it's the people we least expect that become our guardian angels. A couple of years ago, when I was in between jobs, I moved into an apartment to save money. The apartment complex was beautiful. It was a smaller complex located right in the heart of a quiet and nestled community. Most of the residents in the complex were older folks that were retired and just didn't need the space of an entire house. When I was moving into the building, I noticed another young person like me watching from one of the windows. It was a beautiful girl, someone that personally I would consider to be out of my league. Unfortunately, my career didn't allow for much dating. After moving in, I noticed that often I would come or go from the parking lot and I would see the woman looking at me. I just assumed that she was nosy or something like that, and I didn't think for 1 second that she had any interest in me. Down the road from the complex was a grocery store that was very convenient to stop in on my way home from work. One afternoon after work, when I stopped in the store to grab some dinner, I ended up physically running into the girl who had been staring at me for a few days now, and I literally mean that we physically collided with each other. I was turning into an aisle with my head on my phone and she was walking out of the aisle. In a nervous voice, she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm just an idiot sometimes." I started to say it was okay, but stopped when I realized who it was. Once everything clicked, I said, "Hey, are you the girl that lives in my building?" She started to smile and blush and then said, "Yeah, that's me." I'm usually the one who gets nervous and blushes uncontrollably in these kinds of situations, so it was nice that the heat was on someone else for a change. She made some comments about her stupid cheeks turning red, and I responded by telling her that in high school, my friends used to call me a cherry pie because my face was always red. And we both laughed as I diffused the tension. We made small talk for a little while right there in the store, and then that evolved into a real conversation. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask if she wanted to come over for dinner tonight since we were practically neighbors. She smiled and looked thrilled by the offer. She accepted and said that she would be over at around 7, and we exchanged numbers and went about our shopping. I was so excited and nervous about my date with this very attractive neighbor that I had. I realized that I only had about an hour to clean my apartment and get ready. I hadn't had a real date since my freshman year of college, over 4 years ago, so I was admittedly a train wreck in my mind. I even remember while I was cleaning the apartment, I got a text from her that said, "I can't wait for tonight," with a heart. Before I knew it, it was 7, and she was knocking on my door. The first several hours were amazing. We talked, ate dinner, had some wine, and just had a great evening. I felt like this was my first real adult date, and I was proud of how it was unfolding. Late in the evening, I was ready for bed. And this was a weeknight, and I had to work the next day, and I could tell that she wanted to stay, but I made it clear that I wasn't ready for anything further than this. She was understanding, and we said goodnight at around 11 p.m. When I walked her to her door, which sat about 30 feet from my door, I kissed her goodnight, and she smiled. I walked inside my apartment with an overwhelming feeling of joy and happiness. I woke up at around 3 a.m. that morning just to use the bathroom, and I noticed something weird as I walked into the hall. In the light that was shining under the door to my apartment was a shadow, like someone was standing in front of my door. I figured it was my tired eyes just playing tricks on me, so I didn't worry too much. After the bathroom, when I walked by the door again, I noticed that the obstruction to the light was still there. I quietly went over to the door and looked through the peephole in the door, and standing right outside my door was the girl that I had just shared an entire evening with. She looked like she was mumbling something under her breath, but I wasn't sure. If I ever look through one of those holes, they're not very clear sometimes, so I watched for a few seconds and she didn't move at all. I snuck back into my room and grabbed my phone. I made sure that it was silent and went back to the door, and I texted her phone and said, "Hey, I can't sleep, but I just wanted to let you know that I had a great time tonight." Seconds later, she grabbed her phone from her pocket, and with no expression on her face, she responded with, "Me too," with an exclamation point. "I can't wait to see you again." I waited for a moment, and then sent another text that said, "I'm surprised you're awake, what are you up to?" Her response turned the butterflies in my stomach to stone when she responded with, "Oh, just laying in bed, watching Netflix." I couldn't understand why she was standing there and lying about it. I didn't respond to her text right away. I had no idea what to say to this woman or how to approach a situation like this. While I was thinking of something to say, she texted me again, this time saying, "If you want, I can come back, or you can come here." The text was followed by a bunch of emojis. I started to type a response but kept deleting whatever I typed. While I was typing, she texted me again and said, "You have nothing to be afraid of." And that text hit me differently for some reason. I finally sent a simple text that just read, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm really tired." I looked through the hole as she read the message, and still, with no expression on her face, she put the phone back in her pocket and looked right at the peephole. I knew she couldn't see me, but the horror that I felt when I sort of made eye contact with the woman through the door was almost indescribable. The look on her face was not the same look I had just admired that evening prior. Her eyes looked cold, and I have no idea what her intentions were, but I just felt like they weren't good. I know I'm not good at dating, but I do know standing outside someone's door in the middle of the night motionless is not normal behavior. I decided to text her one last time and said, "Hey, did you hear anything funny in the hall? I thought I heard a knock on my door." This was my poor attempt to try and fish something out of her, or at least elicit some reaction. She looked at the text for a minute, then back at the peephole with her cold eyes as if though she knew I was there. And without moving from her position, she texted me one last time that said, "You're a smart boy. Very smart. Sleep tight." She put her head back down, and after about 5 minutes of just standing there, she turned around and went back to her apartment. She looked like she had something tucked in the back of her pants, but looking through the peephole, this could have just been my imagination, so I wasn't sure. I texted her the next day and she never responded. Even though she lived a few doors down, I never did run into her again. I left a note for her one time and slipped it under her door and still never heard from her. I never told the apartment management because I didn't really think anything could be done. It was an unnerving and terrifying experience for me, but I had no proof other than a few text messages that didn't show anything legal or really make any sense. I never saw her again, which is insane considering that I lived at this apartment for 6 months after this experience. The curtains were always shut when I would get home from work, and I never crossed paths with her in the hallway. Now I know the story isn't your typical, "oh god, I'm gonna die" story, but to put yourself in my shoes, I guarantee you wouldn't want to be me. The memory of that look in her eyes still haunts me to this day. Friends have always joked with me that she probably was just looking for some adult companionship, but I promise you this was different. Be careful out there because you never know what kind of intentions people have deep down.
During the spring of 2004, I was 19, even though I looked about 14. I was 5'0" and weighed about 100 pounds. That's if I was carrying laundry. My parents and aunt were vacationing in Mexico. I had decided to opt out and house sit for my aunt. I figured it would be a nice opportunity to have a quiet place to study for my upcoming exams. And all I really had to do was clean the pool, collect the mail, and restock the fridge with groceries. I also had a plan of action that involved emptying her safe and rescuing her car in the event of wildfires. Her place was high up in the hills of Southern California, with a terrific view of Long Beach. I mostly spent my time in the massage chair in the guest bedroom, playing music in the background while I pored over my psychology notes. Occasionally I would sit out on the balcony and work on my tan, or use the treadmill in the basement, but I mostly was secluded in the air conditioning trying to be productive. Every night I would set the alarm and make sure the security cameras were working before I went to bed. But on the 4th night of my stay, I was really focused on the books and forgot to set the alarm after it got dark. At about 1:30 a.m., I paused to take a break. That's when I realized how late it was. My stomach sank as I remembered that the basement door was unlocked, and I had to secure it before setting the alarm. Before heading downstairs, I wandered into the study to get a look at the security cameras just to be safe. I remembered thinking to myself, what are the chances that someone may actually be inside the house? As soon as I finished processing that thought, I saw the figure on the basement stairs. I remembered my mouth falling open and making a small croaking sound. There was a middle-aged, balding man with glasses, slowly making his way up the stairs. And to make the situation even more unnerving, in one of his hands he was holding a balloon. I stared at the cameras as he reached the top of the basement stairs and looked around before cautiously setting foot into the kitchen. My first thought was to slam the door, lock it, and call the cops. But deep down, I knew it would take the police between 10 and 12 minutes just to make it out here, and in that time, this guy could easily overpower me and drag me into the night. I suppose I could have hidden somewhere as well, but I didn't like the idea of trying to stay quiet while he wandered from room to room, searching for me. Instead, I decided to go on the offensive and try something, and it was both incredibly daring and amazingly stupid. I tiptoed back into my room, turned up the music, and then made a loud production of exiting the room, pounding my feet down the hall. I called out as loud as possible, "Marcus, I swear I heard something downstairs. Put on your shirt and grab the key to the gun cabinet." I was positive my voice was quivering as I said it, but I figured the music playing in the background would hide that fact well enough. I paused for a few seconds, waiting to see if he would call my bluff. But when all I heard was the silence from down below, I power walked back into the study, locked the door, and checked the cameras. Sure enough, he was scampering out of the basement door like a frightened squirrel. I watched him run across the backyard, around the pool, and disappear between the hedges. As soon as he was clear of the house, he let go of the balloon, and I watched it from my window as it lazily floated away towards the Pacific. I ran downstairs, locked the basement door, set the alarm, and called the cops. I also called my parents and aunt and told them what happened, asking them how I could rewind the footage to show the police. My aunt asked me why I didn't just hit the panic alarm on the security pad, and I had to admit that I hadn't even thought of that. To make a long story short, the police caught the guy a week later. He was sleeping in his car in a grocery store parking lot. Everyone always asked me what I thought the balloon was all about, and if I had to guess, I think it was a gift. This guy must have seen me a few times outside the house, surmised that I was alone, and assumed I was much younger than I really was. I have no idea if the guy is still in prison, but regardless of where he is, I kind of hope he hears this and feels stupid. He got scared away by nothing but the empty threat of a panicked girl, with the strength of a malnourished gerbil. So this happened last year when I was house sitting for my neighbor. He was in the hospital for a few days recovering from surgery, and I had been asked to stay in the house and keep an eye on his cats. The house was pretty small, but it was on a nice wide open property by the woods, and there was a tiny swinging cat flap on the kitchen door, where the cats could come and go as they pleased. The flap led into a screened-in back porch, and the house only had one bedroom, so I chose to sleep on the couch in the living room. After cleaning up, feeding the cats, and watching some TV, I shut off all the lights and laid back on the couch. I had my phone out and was casually scrolling through Facebook when I heard the flap swinging back and forth. From where I was in the living room, I couldn't see the door because the counter was in the way, but I glanced over to see one of the cats scamper over and leap up on my legs. I gave it a welcoming pat on the head and continued scrolling. After another minute, I heard the cat door make a noise again, a soft squeak. This time, I didn't even glance over, figuring it was the second cat following the first into the house. Another few moments passed. Then I heard the squeaking again, and then after another moment, it squeaked a third time. I looked up from my phone, wondering why the second cat was jumping in and out like that. I was wondering if I would have to scoop it up and put it in the bedroom. The door continued to squeak for another couple of minutes as the second cat continued to jump in and out. I finally decided that I had enough. I put my phone down and sat up on the couch. I began to stretch. As I did, I happened to glance behind the couch, and my blood froze. The second cat was curled up in its bed in the corner, and the first cat was still nestled between my legs. My confusion turned to fear instantly. Was there another animal on the back porch? Another cat, maybe? I slowly stood up and carefully made my way over to the back door, tiptoeing across the carpet in my socks. The door made a squeaking noise again. I peered around the counter and felt the sensation of my heart leaping up into my throat. And at the same moment, my stomach dropped. By the faint rays of the nightlight in the hallway, I saw an arm reaching through the cat door, straining to get at the knob. The fingertips were brushing at the lock, For a few short seconds, all I could do was stare in terror, frozen by the surreal silent reality of what I was experiencing. It almost didn't feel real. The severity of the situation hit me, and I realized that if the intruder got in, I wasn't going to stand a chance. I grabbed a large two-pronged fork that was used for flipping steaks on a grill, and in one swift motion, I stabbed at the arm right below the wrist as hard as I could. There came a thunderous scream of pain from the other side of the door. And the arm was immediately retracted through the flap. But the fork had impaled the intruder, so it caught itself on the door. That produced a second loud scream, and the arm was wrenched violently outside. I heard the clatter of the fork on the ground, and then I heard footsteps sprint across the back porch and out the screen door. I immediately turned on the outside lights and caught the glimpse of a figure running towards the woods. Instead of calling the cops, I scooped up both cats, stuffed them into the same carrier, grabbed my phone, my shoes, and sprinted out to my car, which was thankfully parked inside the garage. I drove up the road a couple of miles to my place, and once I was safely inside, I called the cops. It took them half an hour to get to my place, and then another half hour of questioning before they continued down the road to check out my neighbor's house. They told me that there was no sign that the screen door had been broken into, and aside from the bloodstains, there was no sign of the intruder. They put out an alert to local hospitals for a man with a stab wound on his right arm. The following morning, the police brought a dog out to follow the scent, but whoever the lucky bastard was, he was never caught. I kept the cats at my place until my neighbor was out of the hospital. It still shakes me to my soul, the idea that the stranger chose that house in the middle of nowhere, trying to get inside. And if I hadn't got off the couch when I did, this may have ended very differently. Back in May of 2010, while in desperate need of cash, I agreed to house sit for one of my old high school teachers. He had contacted me via Facebook and asked me if I would be willing to water his plants, collect his mail, and clean up the place while he went out of town for a couple of days. He didn't specify where he was going, but he agreed to pay me $400 for 2.5 days, with half up front, so I agreed. I never really liked him in high school. He was teaching classic literature, and he always seemed to enjoy pointing out any illustrations that in any way featured nudity. His eyes always seemed hungry, and he tended to wheeze like he was out of breath, even though he was kind of a small guy. My friends and I used to refer to him as Mr. Lip Tit. When I arrived at his place, the key was beneath the mat, and $200 were in an envelope on the kitchen table. I turned on my music, watered the plants, cleaned and vacuumed the ground floor, and made myself dinner. I found his house to be extremely boring. It was filled with old books, stacks of newspapers, and ancient-looking furniture that didn't really look comfortable to sit in. I settled into my sleeping bag on the guest bed, but I had a hard time staying asleep. It seemed that every 5 minutes there was another strange noise coming from the house, and it would put me on edge. The following morning, I went back to my own house, had breakfast, and took a shower before coming back and cleaning the second floor. Upon entering the guest bedroom, there was the faint smell of something in the air that definitely had not been there before. And what's more, I could have sworn that my sleeping bag was in a slightly different position when I had left it that morning. I started getting a bad vibe. I decided that night that I would sleep downstairs in the living room. I finished cleaning just after 10 p.m. I made some popcorn and enjoyed some cable TV, which I didn't have at my place. Around 11, I shut off the TV, wrapped myself up in my sleeping bag, and tried to drift off. I was tossing and turning for a bit, and just as I began to doze off, there came a click of the doorknob turning in the other room. I glanced over, and I swear by any god you choose, Mr. Liptak emerged from the pantry wearing only his socks. He then slowly turned the corner and made his way upstairs. I grabbed my phone and my keys and exited out the back door quietly. I ran around front to get into my car and sped home, where I immediately called the cops. I didn't know exactly how to explain the situation to them. I mean, he wasn't breaking and entering. It was his house. But when I explained to the operator that he had deceived me into thinking that he was gone, they sent out a patrol car. I had to collect the stuff that I had left at his house anyway. When the police arrived, Mr. Liptak answered the door wearing my sleeping bag over his shoulders. The police discovered a butler's cupboard, which was a secret room in the pantry that I wasn't aware of, where he had been hiding with a digital camera. He had taken a few dozen photos of me all around the house, most of which when I was sleeping. I showed the police the Facebook messages he sent me, assuring me that he would be out of town, and they arrested him. I collected all my remaining stuff, but left the sleeping bag. I didn't waste any time getting a restraining order against him. Mr. Liptak made bail, but actually died of a heart attack a few weeks later, after being rear-ended in his car at a stoplight. I never got the rest of my money.
In 2010, me and my wife were starting our new life in Raleigh, North Carolina. We both recently graduated with our masters. I got a job teaching at NC State, and my wife secured a job at a local hospital. After thousands of dollars of student debt, all the hard work seemed to pay off finally. That student debt is a whole other horror story for another day, though. In the late summer months, we started our move from our old home in Philadelphia to North Carolina. We had most of our belongings already sent over to our new home, except for one truckload that we were going to drive down ourselves. We rented one of those moving trucks and decided we were going to take that truckload in the middle of the night. I am not the most confident driver in a truck, so we figured making this trip in the middle of the night would be most ideal because traffic would be less intense. For the most part, this was an accurate plan. Traffic was light, and the several-hour drive went splendidly for the first big chunk of the trip. With about 2 hours left on our drive, I ended up running something over and basically exploding the tire. I was able to pull over safely because there was virtually no traffic where we were. The tire was already instantly flat. Whatever I ran over in the road wasn't just a nail or something. My tire seemed like it was annihilated. We remained calm and cool for a moment as we devised a plan. We didn't know if we had to call the moving truck company first, or our insurance, or someone else. We looked in the folder that the rental truck employee gave us, and they had a special number to call in case of any traffic emergency. We deemed it an emergency and called the number. After a couple of hoops, we got someone to come out and help us fix the tire, but it was going to be a little while before they showed up. A major inconvenience, but we figured that we could just sit tight for a while and watch YouTube or something on our phones. In hindsight, we forgot about the most important rule. In any type of accident, you should alert the authorities. This would be a mistake on our part that almost had a definite disastrous outcome. Only a few minutes after getting off the phone with the rental company, my wife nudged me and said, "Hey, there's someone behind the truck. I can see them in the mirror." I looked in the mirror and sure enough, with the red lights of the truck reflecting off his black sweatshirt, was a person. I kept my eye on him for a second, making sure he wasn't going to move. Again, not sure why I didn't just call the police, but the understanding and empathetic person that I am, my mind didn't jump to the police right away. And while I was staring at him in the mirror, she nudged me again, and now with nervousness and fear in her voice, she said, "Oh my God, look." I looked up from the mirror, and another person was in front of the truck. I looked around, and there were no other cars. These people had to have come from the trees on the side of the desolate road we were on. Within seconds, 2 more individuals emerged from behind the truck. It was a young woman and a man, probably in their early 20s or something, and the woman gestured for me to roll down my window. I cracked it so I could hear her. In a soft but friendly voice, she said, "Hi there. I notice you guys are in a bit of a jam. Not the good kind of jam. But anyway, would you like us to change your tire? We're all fairly handy when it comes to cars, aren't we, guys?" I looked at my wife and noticed she had texted 911, something I didn't even know you could do. I looked back at the girl outside and I said, "Thanks, ma'am. That's sweet of you guys. The truck company's going to be here any minute, though, and they're going to be fixing it for us." The woman, who never broke this hypnotic stare and over-the-top smile, looked around and thought for a second. Still smiling and chipper as ever, she responded, "I see. Well, that's too bad. Hey, sir, it's cold out here. Do you think maybe we could get in the back of the truck until your repair guy shows up?" I was completely torn up. In any ordinary situation, I'm the guy who would pick up these kids, give them a ride, feed them, or anything. I also preach that even though there are horrible people in the world, most people are inherently good, but the situation just felt bad. The woman was smiling, but the man behind her was a big burly man and stoic as can be. He didn't break a smile or even blink, I feel like. The person in the front of the truck was still standing there, and the person behind the truck was now out of sight. I tried to keep that nugget of information in the back of my mind, though. Getting out and running was also out of the question. Inside the back of the truck wasn't just furniture, but all our antiques, valuables, family heirlooms, and our personal information. It was not stuff that I just wanted to abandon. At this point, I was just hoping that they would either leave, the 911 text would work faster, or the rental truck company would just show up, but at this point, it didn't seem like any of that was happening soon. I responded to her question with sorrow in my voice. Sorry, ma'am, we're just gonna wait alone. There was a rest stop a few miles back that way. You can go get your friends some food and stay warm." The empath in me thought to kill them with kindness. I suggested that and then dropped a $50 bill out of the crack of the window. The money fell onto the ground and neither one of the two even moved an inch. And this is when I knew we were in trouble. The person in the front of the truck started to approach the side where the other two were standing. The one from the back who disappeared was now on the passenger side right on top of the door. I looked back at the young woman, who was still smiling, and she said, "You know, I think we'll just take the keys, sir. How about it, guys? Let's get these keys." And the big, burly fella moved in front of the woman and started to ferociously try and open my door. At the time, the other man was trying to open my wife's door. In a full panic at this point, I tried to dial 911 again. And while speaking to the dispatch, the lights from the cop car my wife texted could be seen over the horizon. I told the dispatch woman everything that was happening. The cop pulled up, got out of his car, and shouted something at the group of people surrounding the truck. The woman turned and faced the cop, but didn't move from the side of the truck, and she shouted back, "Hey, officer! These two stole our truck! We're just trying to get our keys. Could you pretty please help us?" From the mirror, I saw the cop talk on his radio, and moments later he told everyone around the van to back away and get on the ground. The three men obliged in moving back, but didn't get on the ground. The woman looked at me, then back at the cop and said, "You guys are silly. Bye-bye." In an instant, all four of the potential robbers fled into the tree line. The cop yelled and attempted to chase after them, but only made it to the tree line and then started to radio for help instead. In just a minute or two, several more cops appeared from over the horizon. The first relief I felt since this whole ordeal started. When the cops came, I told the cops everything that I laid out here. All of this transpired within just a couple of minutes. The repair truck came soon after and got us all situated, and we were on our way. What was most unfortunate was that this was most definitely a setup. The cops informed me that they found a thin strip that was covered in dozens of nails, and that was what I didn't see, and I ran over. The nail strip was an intentionally made item to rob or harm an unexpected victim who traveled that desolate road in the middle of the night. I didn't pursue this with the law anymore, even though I probably should have. Some people just get dealt a bad hand and make horrible mistakes, and I just hope these young folks find their way in life and don't have the chance to hurt anyone else. In In 2016, I decided I was going to move out of my hometown and make it all by myself across the country. My entire extended family all lived in my hometown, and none of my cousins or any other family members had any desire to leave. I wanted to be the one who changed that for my family. Of course, they were upset, being that my family is extremely close, but it was time to experience this world outside of my own backyard. I moved from a small town in Idaho to a somewhat small town in Maine. I was so excited to start my life in Maine. I was told that the town that I was moving to had a small summer tourist boom, but most of the time it was quiet and scenic, which is exactly what I wanted. I visited a few months before the move and met a lot of locals who all seemed so lovely. The community was so friendly, and it appeared as if though everyone there just watched each other's backs. The time finally came, and I moved with my fiancée Ricky. The move was mostly harmless, a few lost tempers, but ultimately it went smoothly, and by 6 p.m., we were inside our new home. Unfortunately, the blissful enjoyment of our new home didn't last very long. At some point in the middle of the night, I didn't see the time, we were awoken by a strange sound. It almost sounded like a door slamming. Ricky got out of bed and went to go see. When he returned to the bedroom several minutes later, he said nothing seemed strange or out of place. However, the time it took for him to check and come back seemed way too long. When I asked him what took so long, he told me that the front door was unlocked, which isn't like us, but he said that it was possible with all the excitement from the day that he may have left it unlocked. So, he spent a few minutes looking around the house just in case whatever we heard was an intruder. Thankfully, no intruders, whatever the sound was gone now. He proceeds to kiss me goodnight and told me not to worry about it, and we go to bed. That night was rough. I couldn't sleep at all. Call it women's intuition or call it whatever you want, but something deep down just didn't feel right. That morning we had our coffee and continued to decorate and set up our new home. It wasn't until about 1 p.m. that we finally got ready to leave the house, and on the front steps was a package with a note. And the note just said, "Welcome. Enjoy the house." Ricky grabbed the package and opened it up inside, and it was a drinking glass. Just a regular drinking glass. It looked old, but there was nothing special about it. He laughed and made some jokes about people in Maine being just weird or something, and I laughed, but mostly felt this certain sense of uneasiness. I just knew that something was wrong about this. After the drinking glass package, we went to the store and ran all our necessary errands. Moving is really exhausting. Sometimes you don't realize all the stuff you need and forget until you're all settled in. That night we had dinner, got the internet set up, and watched a movie together. I felt off and anxious the entire evening. We got into bed at around midnight, and shortly after midnight we heard 3 loud bangs. Neither one of us was asleep yet, as we had just got into bed a little while ago. Ricky made his way to the door slowly, and before he could answer the door, bang, bang, bang. 3 loud bangs reverberated through the house again. Ricky shouted from our side of the door, "Who is it?" And what I heard next surprised me. A very old woman shakily shouted,
Please, I need help. There's an intruder out here and I'm not safe."
My fiancé responded,
Okay, just hang tight. I'm calling the police.
The woman shrieked almost instantly,
"No, please, let me in. They're coming."
I stood in the doorway, clenching my sweater. Ricky turned to me, looking for my input, and I just couldn't speak. I just shrugged. If this woman truly was in danger, we were just leaving her for whatever may be out there. Ricky motioned for me to get into the closet that was right outside our bedroom and to call the police. I got into the closet right away and called the authorities. Once he heard me whispering to the dispatch, Ricky opened the door and some very old, frail woman came barreling inside. She started to yell at Ricky,
"Shut the door right away. I saw them out there."
Ricky didn't say anything, much like me. He was trying to process what was even happening. The old woman said again,
Who else is in the house?"
Ricky looked at her and said, "It's just me in the house. Now, here, sit down. Take a deep breath. Relax, I can call the police." The woman became frantic again and started to pace around the living room and said,
My husband is out there. Please, please, you need to help him. You need to let him hide in here or they'll get him.
Ricky looked sympathetic, but told the old woman, "Listen, I'm sorry, ma'am. If it's not safe out there, I'm going to call the police now. They'll be able to help." With the flip of a switch, the old woman stopped with the erratic behavior, and in a much deeper and almost sinister-sounding voice, she said,
"Open the door now, or I'll drain the life out of you."
Ricky was not amused. He looked at the old woman, pointed at the door, and said, "What? You get out right now." The old woman skipped to the door like a freaking child, and when she opened the door, two much younger and much larger men ran in and began to tackle my fiancé to the ground. I stayed hidden the best I could in the closet and watched the struggle from the crack in the door. I held my breath that the police would be there any second. I could see the men kicking Ricky, and I could hear Ricky coughing and struggling, all while the old woman cheered and cackled. I don't know exactly how long it was. It was probably only moments, but the police lights could be seen through the windows. All three intruders ran out the back door, as if they knew exactly where the door was. On the way out the door, the old woman grabbed the package with the glass, and she yelled,
"Enjoy the house, Ricky!"
The fact that somehow she knew his name made me cry, even more than I already was, and by the time the cops got inside, the intruders were out the door and gone. Ricky got to his knees and struggled to get to his feet after the beating he received. We gave the police all the information we could think of, the random package with the note, which the woman took, so we didn't even have that in our possession. We told them that the intruders seemed to know the layout of the house well, and we were able to give the cops a mostly accurate description of the intruders, as they weren't wearing masks at all. The fact that I could see their faces and eyes made them so much scarier. The two men looked sort of clean-cut, both young, and they were bigger and muscular looking, and both had a little bit of scruff, but the neat kind of scruff. One dirty blondish and the other had dark hair. The one with the darker hair was balding, and the other man had his hair pulled into a bun. The older woman was extremely frail and small-looking, and she had this skin that looked as if though it were almost dripping off of her body. She had long, straight white hair, and from what I could see from my vantage point, no teeth, and I'm not sure about that last bit. The police were unable to catch these intruders, but that didn't matter to us. The next day we stayed in a hotel for a few nights and then moved back to Idaho. Being alone with no family during that ordeal nearly broke me, and then, more than ever, I needed my family. I still live in Idaho to this day, and I have no intentions of ever moving away after that nightmare. What's most frustrating is that I never did get my answers. I have no idea why we were targeted. I can see the events played out in my head as if it were yesterday, and it still makes me sick. The most frustrating and downright horrifying detail of the story is the details that my fiancé told me after we had already moved home to Idaho. Information he didn't tell the cops because he said it wouldn't have mattered anyway. That first night with the loud noise we had heard, Ricky said the door was unlocked. Well, that's true, but it was more than unlocked. The front door was wide open, and so was the back door. The door the intruders ran out of the second night. Whoever these monsters were, they were in my home the night before. I have not slept right since this ordeal, and I'm not sure that I'll ever sleep right again.
So this happened back when I first moved in with my most recent ex-girlfriend. We'd rented a small apartment in a city that was well known for crime in my country. It was cheap and it was close by to the city center where we both went to university, so it was perfect at the time. However, as stated before, it was also extremely dangerous and run down. For example, homeless people lived in our communal rubbish rooms downstairs out by the car park, and you could probably find a needle or drug bag every square foot of the surrounding area, and not to mention the sounds of police sirens a few times a night. But as I said, it was just a place for the time being. Also, for some context, I'm gay and I'm a girl. I'm average height but quite stocky. Nothing scary, but I was definitely larger than my small petite girlfriend at the time. We went to bed one night and all was normal, and as I'm trying to fall asleep, my ex tells me that she's hungry and she wants a pizza. So she pulls out her phone, sits up, and is ordering herself some Domino's, and she then asks if I want anything. Being tired and it already being almost midnight, I declined, but I told her to be safe when collecting it. I let her know that if she felt unsafe, I'd be more than happy to get it with her. After a few minutes, I drifted off to sleep. The last thing I heard was her tapping on her phone, still ordering. I awoke later on to my phone ringing for some reason. My heart began to beat erratically, and I shot up to grab my phone. It was my ex-girlfriend's name, and she was no longer in the bed with me. Now, I had only been asleep for about an hour at this point, but through my sleepy haze, I managed to quickly answer the phone, and I then remembered that she must have ordered her pizza. My ex was hysterical and scared, speaking extremely fast. The pizza guy said he's not that far away, so I've come down to wait. And there's a group of men in the car, and they're trying to get me to get inside of it. She cries on the phone to me. I race to get ready and burst out of my apartment, all while trying to calm her down. She then tells me that they had tried to force her in the car, and they then began ordering her in the vehicle with them, and that they're now laughing at her. As I mentioned before, I'm nothing scary, so I knew I wouldn't have been able to take these men on physically. So as I'm running down to the first set of stairs, I see that the window's open. I tell my ex to come back inside, and she tells me she's in the doorway to the block, meaning I'm just above her. Knowing that she's now safe away from them, I peek out of the large window to then see a black Toyota parked in the do not park area of our car park, which is right by the door. Now, not knowing what else to do, I shout down to them. I'm telling them to back the hell off and that I'm gonna get all my brothers to go down there, which was definitely a lie. The men weren't sure where I was at first, and I could see them moving their heads around to look. They had their interior light on, and they were all dressed in dark clothes. One of them caught me leaning out of the window and then cursed at me to mind my own business. I had so much adrenaline and anger that I just started to curse back at them, calling them all sorts of names. It wasn't until I just randomly started shouting, "Dad, come over here!" behind me up the set of stairs, and then some random male-sounding name did they start their car and book it from the parking lot. My girlfriend at the time met me halfway on the stairs, and I decided to wait inside by the doors with her for her food. I'm so glad that nothing else happened, and that she managed to get back to the doors in time before anything else went on. The area that my ex was and where the doors were was honestly about 15 feet, meaning she literally was just outside of her home when this happened. Luckily, the doors to that building were thick and metal, and they only required a little fob to get in, and not an actual key, which would have taken a lot longer to open. I just really hope those men never do that to anyone else again.
I was 14 years old, and my mom and I had been living in a 3-bedroom double-wide trailer ever since we left my dad. My mom worked a full-time job, which meant that from Monday to Friday, I would have the house for myself for about 2 hours after getting home from school and before she got home from work. I usually would spend my time on my computer or working on writing my D&D campaign, and in no time at all, my mom would be home. At least, that was when I felt comfortable in my house. That all changed though, one day when I found myself walking in on a burglary in progress. I had just gotten home from school, and when I walked into my house, everything seemed normal. I walked inside and locked the door behind me before taking my shoes off. And as I was in the process of taking off my shoes, I could have sworn I heard something come from the room where we used to store our moving boxes in the back of the trailer. At first, I assumed it was just a box or the house settling, and I didn't pay the noise any mind. But before I could even stand up from taking my shoes off, I heard it again. This time it worried me a bit, so I decided to call out to see if my mom had come home early. But when I yelled out, there was no response. Still, something felt a bit odd to me, so I decided to check the room out real quick before getting comfortable. I poked my head through the door and looked around, but from what I could tell, nothing had changed, which reassured me that I had in fact heard the house settling. After that, I went about my normal routine. I stepped into my room and put my backpack on my bed before walking back out into the kitchen for a quick snack. I reached into the cabinet and pulled out a fruit roll-up, but before I could open it, I heard another sound coming from the back room. Only this time, it was followed by something that shook me to my core. After the sound of something thumping on the ground in the room, I heard what was undoubtedly a man let out a single cough. I dropped my snack and instinctively began running through the house and toward my bedroom. I'm not sure why I chose my room instead of the front door. Maybe it was where I felt the safest. But either way, I sprinted into my bedroom, which was 2 doors down from the back room, and without hesitating, I did the only thing I could think of, just like I had seen in movies. I grabbed my wooden desk chair and propped it up against my bedroom door. It was perfect timing too, because as soon as the door was wedged shut, whoever was in my house began banging up against my bedroom door. I fell back in fear and began looking around to think of what I could do next, and that was when I came to my senses. I looked over to my window and saw my escape. I was able to open it up and push the screen out before climbing through it. And since we lived in a trailer, the window were only about 5 feet off the ground. Once I was out of the house, I quickly ran through my yard and over to my neighbor's house. It only took him a few seconds before he answered the door after I began pounding on it and screaming for help. My neighbor opened the door and I explained to him what was happening. He didn't question it at all, and as soon as he saw the panic in my face, he let me into his house and we both waited there for the police and my mom to arrive home. The police showed up about 30 minutes before my mom did, but it was still too late to catch the intruder. By the time they showed up, he had already left the house. Not before destroying it though. All 3 of the rooms appeared to be ransacked, and my mother's jewelry collection was missing. For a while, I ended up staying at my neighbor's house or a friend's house after school while I waited for my mom to get home. I just wasn't comfortable being alone in my house anymore. I will never forget the first weekend that I had the house to myself, and not for the reasons you probably think. I mean, sure, I had a massive party planned, which most likely would have just turned out to be a small hangout session with my friends, but I never reached that point in the weekend. You see, the first night that I had the house to myself, I decided to take it easy and spend most of the time cleaning for the company that I was expecting to come over the following day. I straightened up the living room and the bathroom before wiping down all the counters in the kitchen, and by the time I was finally finished, I had worked up a bit of an appetite. I decided to make myself some breakfast for dinner and began making some scrambled eggs and bacon. Then after eating, I noticed that I made a mess with the bacon grease, so once again, I wiped down the counters, which is where I made my biggest mistake. After wiping down the counter, I left the towel in the same corner that the stove was in. I didn't think anything of the situation and ended up watching a movie by myself before heading into my room and falling asleep. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I was woken up as I began choking in my sleep. My eyes shot open and could barely see anything that was around me. My room and the rest of the house had been filled with thick, dark smoke, and by the time I had woken up, there was no telling how much I inhaled. I tried to stand, but right away could tell that I was very lightheaded. After managing to sit, I quickly dropped down to my hands and knees and began crawling across the floor underneath the smoke. Crawling on all fours, I made my way out of my bedroom and through the house towards the front door. As I passed by the kitchen, I could see the flickering flames dancing in the corner near the stove. There was nothing I could do at that point, so I just continued to crawl toward the front door. Sadly, by that point, I inhaled too much smoke, and everything around me went dark as I began to pass out. I thought I was a goner, but lucky for me, my neighbor had seen the flames from his house. He apparently busted through the door and pulled me out of the house and saved my life. I didn't wake up until I was already in the ambulance and heading toward the hospital.
My husband and I got married on February 9th of 2010, and to save us the double whammy to our wallets, we picked a weekend around that time to have a joint Valentine's/anniversary celebration together. These celebrations usually involve a simple staycation-style holiday back when we were both on lower salary bands. But as the years went on and we got our finances in order, we started venturing further afield than just London or the home counties. Then, around Christmas of 2016, I was looking at potential Valentine's destinations when I suddenly found myself falling deep down the cottagecore rabbit hole. Now, back in the mid-2010s, it wasn't quite the same kind of cottagecore aesthetic that emerged on social media during the pandemic. Like, a lot of inspiration came from Japanese mori fashion, which emphasizes muted colors and nude shades like beige, brown, off-white, light green, and earthy red, as well as natural materials like cotton, linen, wool, and leather. But anyway, after seeing a lot of posts outlining mori styles and aesthetics, I suddenly got a bee under my bonnet about staying in a remote country cottage over Valentine's weekend. When my husband agreed, we started looking at a few places and eventually settled on a small, cozy-looking cottage up in North Yorkshire. We booked the place from Friday the 12th to Sunday the 14th, with plans to drive back home on the Monday morning, and by early February, I was beginning to get really excited about the whole thing. Work had been hellish, the weather had been crap, and not one but two of our appliances were on the brink, so I really needed a little getaway by the time Valentine's Day loomed on the horizon. On the day itself, we got the earliest train possible up to York, then took a taxi out to the cottage. It turned out to be everything we could have possibly hoped for. A lot of Airbnb really try and do you over with the angles of pictures and all that, but all the fixtures and fittings were of the utmost quality. Me and my husband had a bath together in the giant tub that had been fitted upstairs, then, after wandering into a nearby village, we got some pub food, had a couple of pints, then went back to the cottage to get some sleep. The next morning was just blissful. We had nothing planned, no work commitments to worry about. It was just me, him, and a weekend of coziness to look forward to. I made us some bacon and eggs, then, after a long, steamy shower together, we sprawled ourselves on the living room settee and just relaxed. We had our phones switched off. Almost no one knew where we were, and the cottage was basically smack bang in the middle of nowhere, which made it all the more surprising when, at some point in the early afternoon, we heard a knock at the front door. It actually spooked us a little bit at first, hearing 3 piercing bangs out of absolutely nowhere. But regardless, we knew we had to answer it, as it might have been the host trying to get some important info to us. After all, we've had our phones switched off all morning, so up we get, making sure to fasten our dressing gowns nice and tight so we don't give the visitor a surprise peep show. Then we open up the door. Standing in front of us was a man around my dad's age, so mid-50s to early 60s, and behind him up the driveway is a large, plain white van. He gives us a warm and friendly greeting, then tells us that the owners have hired him and his building firm to do a bit of emergency renovation work. That meant that we'd have to vacate the property for around 2 to 3 hours. As you can imagine, me and my husband were very bewildered about the situation. The Airbnb host hadn't mentioned anything about any renovation work, and there certainly didn't seem to be any sort of emergency inside. Everything looked fine. When we suggested that there must have been some kind of mistake, the bloke just shrugged like it wasn't his problem, told us a job's a job, then asked us what time we'd be okay vacating for a couple of hours. My husband rarely gets annoyed at things like that. He's a very patient person, but the idea of paying almost $1,000 to then have our holiday interrupted, I could tell that he was fuming about it. Fuming though he was, my husband asked the builder if he didn't mind waiting a few minutes because he wanted to give the host a call to clear a few things up. Suddenly, the builder's attitude changes completely, and instead of being all polite, he just said, "Oi," in this really aggressive way, stopping my husband in his tracks as he was closing the front door. Then I swear to God, he says, "I tried the easy way. Don't make me do things the hard way." Both me and my husband are like, "You what?" Both pretty offended as how rude he was being. Then as he starts prattling on about us leaving the cottage, my husband shouts something about calling the police before slamming the door in his face. We didn't call the police, not right away anyway. Instead, I grabbed my phone and got onto the host to see if the man's claims were genuine. It took a while to get them to call us back, but when they did, they denied having arranged any kind of building work. We then tried to clarify who the man was and why he'd been so threatening, but the host claimed to have no idea. They asked us to call the police if we didn't feel safe, and if we really didn't want to stay another night, we could leave with a full refund if we'd considered booking another time. The host and his wife were those two pensioners who supplemented their income through the rentals, and they were so sweet about the whole thing. So instead of us turning tail and running at the first sign of trouble, we decided to stay for the duration of our booking and enjoy the holiday we'd worked so hard to afford. Whatever the weird bloke's game was, we were pretty confident that the threat of calling the police would dissuade him from whatever he had in mind. And if it didn't, well, we just crossed that bridge when we came to it. If we'd have known what was about to happen, if the bloke had given us any clue whatsoever, we'd have been out of there within the hour. But he didn't. When he turned nasty, it was all these cryptic, antagonistic warnings and threats that were only ever going to provoke a defensive response. We had no idea what he had in mind, so we stayed, and a couple of hours later, it all started to go downhill. It's early evening, so about 6 o'clock, and because of the time of year, it's almost completely dark outside. Obviously, we were still quite concerned by the strange bloke's bizarre visit, but after my husband found an old cricket bat in his upstairs cupboard, we felt marginally safer. On top of that, hours had gone by and we'd seen hide nor hair of our unwelcome visitor, so we just crossed our fingers that we'd see no more of him and got on with our romantic weekend getaway. We weren't feeling particularly hungry, and the pub served food until 8, so we decided on a quick dip in the giant bath before beginning the walk into the village. The upstairs layout was such that the bathroom was on the front side of the cottage, with the bedroom at the rear. The bedroom had this cute pair of wooden framed windows that opened outward into the back garden, but the bathroom had only one small circular window that opened just a crack. If you looked out, you could see the cottage's driveway, along with a little bit of the lane outside, so when we were in the bath and we thought that we heard a noise coming from outside, my husband climbed out of the tub and peered through the glass onto the driveway. Like I might have already mentioned, my husband is the most emotive person, definitely the counterweight to me being very fiery, but that's another story. You hardly ever see him angry, and you never see him scared. So when he turned around to me, and I saw this look of blind terror on his face, I knew that we were in a hell of a lot of trouble. "Get out of the bathroom, put some clothes on," was all he said after that, and he ran to the bedroom to do so himself. You can imagine how panicked I am, because he still hadn't told me what he'd seen that had got him so frightened. It was the bloody zombie apocalypse for all I knew, so while I too rushed to put some clothes on, I'm asking him over and over again what's going on. Please just tell me what's happening. "There are people outside. They've got masks on. We need to hide." I knew it was connected to the guy who'd visited us in the early afternoon. I just bloody knew it. I just hadn't the foggiest idea how. I made sure to throw on as many layers as I could, knowing that we'd probably end up running out the back door or something if the blokes outside tried coming through the front. Then bang. What turned out to be a sledgehammer smashed into the front door, and we take that as our cue to get the hell out of there. We ran downstairs, actually saw the damage that was done to the door by whoever was breaking it down, then bolted towards the kitchen, which is where the back doors were. It was very scary, but I remember knowing that whatever the man or men wanted, it involved the cottage, not us. If we just ran off and stayed away for a few hours, everything would be fine, right? Wrong. My husband swung open the back doors after struggling to unlock them, But instead of being greeted by the path to freedom, we were greeted by a man in a balaclava with a massive crowbar-looking thing in his hands. We were trapped. The man with the crowbar thing ordered us back into the house, and he was soon joined by another masked man carrying what looked an awful lot like a big saw. One of them told my husband, "If you do anything stupid, we'll kill your missus." And that kept him fairly quiet. Me, on the other hand, I was just so scared, so I kept saying all sorts of things begging them not to hurt us, that we were sorry, that we'd just leave if they let us go free. All they replied with was, "Shut up, shut your mouth." And then the next thing I know, we're being led into one of the upstairs rooms and made to kneel. I was so scared that they were going to kill us. All that assurance that they were there to rob the house or something just completely went out the window, and in the end, I had to make so much noise that they shoved a pillowcase in my mouth to keep me quiet. The next thing I remember, the intruders made my husband tell them where our phones were, and that gave me more hope that they weren't going to hurt us. They didn't seem like petty thieves, so taking our phones was to ensure us that we wouldn't be able to phone the police once they left, I was thinking. I only really started to calm down and compose myself when I heard some really loud banging from downstairs, and my husband started reminding me that they weren't there for us, that they were just looking for something, and if all the hammering was anything to go by, it was something in the walls. Since we were told to keep completely quiet, we could hear all the smashing and bashing downstairs, and we could hear the guys saying things to each other. You could hear, "Try this one here," and then bang. Someone would smash a sledgehammer into a wall. Then you'd hear others ripping the wood and plaster apart, no doubt looking for something. They did this over and over again until finally, you heard someone downstairs shout, "Got it." I couldn't see what was going on, but you could tell that they'd found what they were looking for because there was this big flurry of activity before the guy guarding us suddenly leaned in and growled something to us. "I don't want to hear an effing peep out of the two of you until we're gone. You try anything, and we'll kill both of you." After that, he was gone, and after a little bit more activity from downstairs, the cottage was silent again. Neither of us moved for what felt like a very long time. Even though it felt like we were in the clear, I couldn't stop shaking. In fact, I think I was shaking harder then than I was when they were tying our hands, blindfolding and gagging us. And that was just all raw fear. What came next was this emotionally exhaustive adrenaline come down. When we finally thought it was safe, my husband somehow wriggled his way out of his bindings, then untied mine as he tried to reassure me. I just burst into tears as he hugged me, having never felt so grateful to be alive in my whole life. It felt like we lived through a nightmare come to life. It was surreal in the extreme, and once we collected ourselves, we began to creep downstairs to survey the damage. The cottage was completely empty apart from us, but we crept downstairs nonetheless, taking in a stare at a time in total silence, terrified that a masked man would suddenly reappear in what remained of the front door frame. Thankfully, no one came back, and as we edged our way into the front room, our jaws dropped at the extent of the damage. They'd taken a sledgehammer, along with a saw and God knows what else, and they'd torn up all the walls in both the front and back rooms of the cottage. It was a total mess, but through all the torn up wallpapers and layers of settled plaster dust, a sort of pattern started to emerge. Most sections of wall bore a few sledgehammer strikes, but only one section was completely torn out. Just like we'd heard them, they'd been probing sections of the wall before they found whatever they were looking for. Then they'd torn out that whole section to retrieve it. We had a good look inside the hole they'd made, but there was no trace of whatever had been hidden there. They'd also smashed the landline phone, so there was no contacting anyone without walking into the nearby village to get some help. So that's what we did. We set up camp in the corner of the local pub, and after hearing what happened to us, the locals were basically lining up to buy us pints and offer their condolences. This was great for me, as I definitely needed something to calm my nerves, but not so much for my husband, who was our designated driver back to London a few hours later. We had some dinner, they made calls to the police, the Airbnb host, and our loved ones back home, each explaining the situation and what we planned on doing next. After that, we waited around the pub to give a statement to one of the local coppers whose colleagues had driven over to the cottage to cordon off their crime scene. We told him what we knew, swapped contact details, then got started on the drive back to London. We were still very shaken up, and if they hadn't bashed the door down in bloody February, we'd have probably just stayed the final night. So all we were interested in when we got home were hot showers and early nights. But then the following morning, the theories started. Over breakfast, we started to talk about how bad we felt for the owner. Granted, what we went through was extremely grim, but we weren't hurt and they'd stolen nothing but our phones, which were both insured, thankfully. On the other hand, our sweet retiree hosts had their pension investments smashed up, all after sinking thousands into renovating it. But then, what had the masked men taken, and who did it belong to? It was obviously so important and possibly so illegal that they felt the need to tie us up, blindfold us, and deny us any means of contacting the police so they were safe to retrieve it. But after that, all we had was unanswered questions, and increasingly wild ones at that. I'd like to tell you that we found out, or even that we came up with some kind of solid theory, but the God's honest truth is that we're flummoxed, and apparently so are the police. To our knowledge, the owners hadn't reported anything stolen, and even with the security camera footage which showed the group of men arriving, they just didn't have enough to go on to make any arrests. The rest of the story is a bit boring and involves refunds, insurance claims, and a lot of retelling the whole event to friends and relatives. It was horrible, but like I've said, neither of us are particularly traumatized, and we both firmly put it all behind us. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd give my left arm to know what had been hidden in that bloody wall.
My name is Emily, and this took place back in 2014 when I was a sophomore at my new high school. For reference, I'm a female, and I was 16 years old at the time of this story. I had just moved to the school from my hometown in Savannah due to a job change from my dad where he could make a better income. Because I was a new student at the school, I was definitely no popular kid. I was in the honors program and was your typical nerd wandering around who only focused on her studies and had trouble interacting with new people. That one girl who you'd think has no life and no friends, only to end up being the most brightest student in school. Even though I had 0 friends at the time, there was still this one guy in 2 of my classes who seemed really nice. His name was Jake, and he was a pretty cool guy for the most part. He'd ask me about what I was studying, if I liked the school, and so on and so forth. After a while, I started to consider Jake as a real friend and was glad to finally meet someone. On Valentine's Day, I was sitting down at a table at school, eating my lunch, when Jake walks up to me and straight up asks me if I wanted to be his Valentine. The thing was that he had brought me a bouquet of roses and a bunch of chocolate, which I found odd. I was speechless at first and really wasn't expecting him to do that. Jake and I only met not even a month ago, and I didn't really see him other than a friend. I politely turn him down, and he begins to give me a look full of disappointment, and he then gets up to leave. I felt bad, obviously, but I really wasn't looking for a relationship at the time as I had other stuff to worry about. That night, I was finishing up my project that was due for my chemistry class when I heard my Skype start ringing. I take a look at my computer and see that an unknown number is calling me. After all, I have been begging one of my cousins to try it out so we could chat through there. When I answer the call, I heard the all too familiar voice of Jake on the other end of the line. I immediately hang up and turn off my laptop for the rest of the night, not wanting to talk with Jake anymore. I have no idea as to how he managed to get my Skype, not to mention my phone number. I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night, and I was afraid of going to school the next day, fearing Jake and what he'd possibly say to me. For whatever reason, I finally decided to go and was surprised to find that Jake had not been in either one of my classes. It was strange, but I was honestly relieved. During one of my classes, we were all going over our tests when my teacher gets a phone call and tells me to go to the office for something. The sophomores at the school were still a bit immature, and I was bombarded with oohs and laughs while walking out. I get to the main office and go into the conference room and was greeted to 3 police officers as well as my principal and another student that I have never seen before sobbing. They tell me to have a seat and get straight to the point and begin to ask me about Jake. My face went pale and I was honest with them and told them that he had been stalking me for a few days now. They went on to explain that Jake was planning on killing me and another student on that specific day because we had both rejected him to be his Valentine. They didn't say how he was planning on doing this, but they were eventually told by another student that he was planning on something and my name was mentioned. I was petrified and couldn't even move due to the sheer panic I was feeling inside of me. The whole school had issued an email and a phone call to all the staff and parents addressing that there was a threat and that the school would be on high alert. They had refused to give me any more information about how they found this out or as to why he didn't show up for school. My parents pulled me out of school for a week until Jake was taken care of and that there wouldn't be a threat to me anymore. It turns out, Jake was known to have told threats against people, especially females who have turned him down or did him wrong in some way. There hasn't been any clear evidence that he's ever done something like that in the past, but just because he's never done it before, it doesn't mean that he'll never do it. I never saw Jake again after that incident, and he thankfully never returned to school. I still don't know if he was expelled, locked in prison, or perhaps something even worse. This incident will forever be with me for the rest of my life, knowing that someone had the sheer desire to end my life, all because of a rejection.
This started when I was in middle school. I was 12 at the time, so having a Valentine was everything to me. I was a social kid, and I liked this boy. We'll call him Kenneth, and honestly, I thought he liked me back. Every day of that February after lunch, there were little notes that someone put in my locker. I thought it was weird because his locker was far from mine, but I was a daydreamer. I just thought that he liked me back, that he liked me enough that he would leave notes for me. The day before Valentine's, a kid that was very skinny and was wearing a black hood with a lion's logo stood in front of my locker, blocking me from it. "Hi," he said, shivering. "Would you like to go on a date?" I had never seen this guy before. I was trying to see how awkward it would be if we were on a date, and we didn't know what to talk about. "Sorry, I have plans," I said, and I walked away. It was really weird. Later, I was walking home, and I stopped to get something from Target. I was looking at some candy bars when I noticed someone that was as tall as me. He had this hood, with a lion's logo on it. I left with the candy bar, and I started to make my way home. I called my mom to tell her that I was going to be late. There was a shortcut that was an abandoned train station. I would only take it when I was going to be late. As I was walking, a bush next to me started to move. And I don't know why, but after what I saw at the store, I freaked out, and I ran the rest of the way home. When I finally got home, I got out my phone and I saw a text. It was from an unknown number. There were pictures of me running and me walking around the store. I immediately showed them to my mom, and she simply said it was probably friends. Friends or not, that's simply creepy. The next day I showed my friends the number. They looked at the number and said, That's That's the weird kid's number. I know because he gave it to me and I never texted him. This really freaked me out. I still see him around the school, but when I do, I'll glare at him, and I try to keep my distance. And number 6, The Break-In, submitted by Ralph. For this story, I will need to tell you a bit of background information. I am 6 feet tall, 16 years old, and I live in a very small country named Latvia. Probably some of you know it. I have shared this story only with close friends, other family members, and my parents. We live in a 2-story house, and my room is on the 2nd floor. My parents often leave me home alone because they travel a lot for work things. This happened on Valentine's Day 2015. It was a cold winter night, and I had just broken up with my girlfriend, so I was completely alone to watch the house. It was around 8 that night. I was downstairs watching TV shows on Netflix when I heard a light knocking on my living room door. I got up to look outside, and there was no one there. After an hour or so, I heard the tapping again. I peeked outside, only to see someone running by the bush where the road leads to another street. I thought someone was pranking me, so I didn't really care too much. After a half hour of watching TV shows, I got bored, so I asked my friend to come over. He lived about 5 minutes away from where I live. For safety purposes, I'll call him Jake. Jake was shorter than me and a year younger. He came over and we played some video games. After a while, I needed to go pee, so I went upstairs to use the bathroom. When I got back to the living room, Jake told me he heard tapping on the window. I wasn't surprised, and I told him before he got here I heard the tapping too. 1 hour passed, and then we heard the tapping coming again, and we ignored it. After about 3 minutes, we heard footsteps upstairs, and that's when things got serious. We muted the game. The footsteps stopped. We thought the footsteps were in the game, so we continued to play, trying to listen at the same time. Then we heard something heavy fall upstairs in my parents' bedroom. I paused the game and me and Jake went upstairs. We checked every room. We checked my parents' last. I peeked inside the room and saw nothing. It was pitch black, and I turned on the light and went into the room with Jake behind me. Jake checked the closet and I checked everywhere else. As we were leaving the room, I forgot that we did not check under the bed, so I hesitantly asked Jake if he could just quickly look. He walked over slowly, obviously a bit anxious. He looked under the bed, and he jumped up faster than I've ever seen him get up. He bolted out of the room without saying a word, and I quickly turned off the light and slammed the door shut. Jake was already downstairs. I rushed down there to him, and he was pale as snow. I asked him what was wrong, and his answer made my heart sink. He said there was someone under the bed, smiling with eyes wide open. We rushed outside and called the police. We hid behind a bush that was in front of my home. As I was on the line with the police officer, Jake and I saw my parents' bedroom light come on. I asked them to come over as fast as they possibly could. We watched the house for about 10 minutes, but we saw no movement inside. When police finally arrived, 2 officers went to search the house, and the 3rd officer asked a couple of questions. After a moment, the 2 police officers came out of the house with a middle-aged man. He had a long beard with wide, bloodshot eyes. His face was full of scars and bruises. Now I get why Jake looked so pale. One of the police officers told us that the man had a knife hidden in one of his pockets. He had broken in by an unlocked bedroom window, but how on earth did he get up to the 2nd floor? I have no idea. The police called my family, who said they'd be back in town as soon as they possibly could. Nothing like that has happened since that day, but I still get goosebumps thinking about and writing this, because it sounds like, even if I didn't invite Jake over, I still wouldn't have spent Valentine's Day alone.
My name is Jen. I'm in my 40s and me and my friend run a business via Airbnb here in the UK. We own a few different properties across London, and while my friend acts as the financial backing, I run the day-to-day business of dealing with repairs and quest queries, as well as inspecting the rentals both before the guests arrive and after they check out. As you can imagine, summertime is our busiest period of the year, with business picking up a lot around Christmas too. But then we always have this really quiet period around the autumn where we struggle to break even, and it really puts a dent in our annual profits. So imagine our joy when last year we got a 3-week-long booking for one of our swankier properties in North London. It was a huge payday for us, even with the block discount that Airbnb mandates, and we tried to be as welcoming and accommodating as possible to increase the chance of repeat business. For those of you that have used Airbnb before, you'll know that the vast majority of rentals are completely non-contact, and that style of rental only increased over the course of the pandemic. That means that we didn't meet our renters even once, and throughout the whole of their 3-week stay, we didn't receive a single call from them. The only thing we knew is that one of the 2 guests was a girl named Alice. Alice paid the deposit, the rental fee, everything. So about halfway through the stay, I dropped Alice a text to ask if everything was going okay. The reply said nothing other than, fine, thanks, so we assumed their stay was going wonderfully. I certainly wasn't complaining that they were low-maintenance guests because, as much as I don't mind helping out where and when I'm needed, there's nothing worse than a guest who keeps calling you up every 5 minutes, asking where things are, claiming that things are broken when they're not. When their 3 weeks were over, I made my way over to the flat to make sure everything was in order. I wasn't expecting anything to be rough. Maybe a few towels left on the floor, maybe a full bin bag, the usual stuff that people leave behind when they're in a hurry to leave. We'd had someone really make a mess of one of the flats before after having an all-night party there, so I was always ready to be greeted by an absolute horror show. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that flat that day. I knew something was wrong almost immediately after trying to get into the flat, as there seemed to be something blocking the door from the other side. It took me a good few shoves to get in, then I saw that someone had piled some chairs up against the door as a means of slowing down entry, but not completely barring access. I also noticed how cold it was, which was the first hint that I got that someone had left one of the windows open, something we specifically asked guests not to do since the area had something of a pigeon problem. I rather quickly deduced that whoever had tried to bar the door had done so, then used a window to actually leave the flat. By why ever in God's name they'd want to do that was a complete mystery to me, at least for the next few minutes anyway. I walked into the living room to shut the window, and I could tell that it was the living room because of the cold breeze coming from it, and that's when I saw the mess they'd made. But unlike the mess the partiers leave behind, which tended to be loads of empty bottles and cans, cigarette butts, that sort of thing, the place looked like there had been some kind of fight. Loads of glasses and plates were smashed, the chairs were gone, the tables were overturned. It was a complete mess. The next place I checked was the bedroom, deciding to leave the bathroom till last because I was honestly dreading whatever had been left in there, and seeing the state the bedroom had been left in just made me dread it even more. There were all kinds of empty condom wrappers all over the bedroom, as well as all kinds of adult toys strewn around the room. The sheets had stains on them, and God knows what they'd come from, but the whole room just reeked of you-know-what. It was disgusting. Finally, I braced myself to check the bathroom to see what kind of mess had been left behind, expecting something god-awful that I'd probably have to spend the rest of the morning cleaning. But then, like I said, I could never have been ready for what was behind that door. I pushed open the bathroom door, took a peek inside, then immediately slammed it closed after seeing something lying in the bath. Something person-shaped. I say person-shaped because just from the split second I saw it, it didn't actually look like a person, not a living one anyway. It was all lumpy and covered in gore, almost like it was just pieces of fresh meat butchered and piled on top of one another. I think I was just in denial about what I saw at first. I mean, I didn't want it to be what it was, and so in those few moments, I tried to think of everything it could have been instead of what it actually was. I don't know what actually drove me to open the door again. I certainly didn't want to, if that makes any sense. I think I'd actually managed to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real, that I'd just assumed the worst after seeing the rest of the flat, and that it just wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Only, It was as bad as I thought it was. If anything, it was worse. It was a body, and it was just lying there in the bath in probably the worst condition you can possibly imagine. Partly the reason why I didn't recognize it as one immediately is because the girl's face was so beaten up that she didn't even look human anymore. There wasn't a single patch of skin that didn't have blood drying on it, but it wasn't that brown-looking blood that had clotted. It actually still looked kind of fresh, like it had only been there for a few hours at the most. I immediately pulled my phone out, dialing 999 to tell them that I needed the police as quickly as they could get there. The girl, who I assume was the girl who'd rented from us, was just laying there, perfectly still, and I couldn't hear her breathing or anything, so I just assumed that she was dead. I even told the bloke on the other end of the line that I was almost certain she was dead, and that's when he asked me to check her pulse to make sure. I did as he asked, 100% certain that I wouldn't feel a thing because in my mind, no one on earth could survive the kind of violence that she'd been put through. I don't even think I was touching the right spot on her neck at first, because again, I couldn't feel a thing, and after racking my brain for a minute, trying to remember the girl's name, I think I just blanked because of the panic. I just said, "Alice?" And then, she opened her eyes. Having that happen, like she'd properly come back from the dead or something, was the single most terrifying moment of my life. It was absolutely horrendous. They were all bloodshot too, and one of them had absolutely no white in the eye whatsoever. It was just a bright red mess of broken blood vessels. Then, as soon as she laid eyes on me, she started screaming and lashing out, terrifying me so much as I just ran out of the flat and into the corridor outside while shouting that she's alive down the phone. I remember the guy on the other end of the phone telling me to go and unlock the front door to the flat building, since it was an old-style place with a door you could leave on the latch. After that, I had to run back upstairs to make sure the girl didn't let herself out of the flat, as she had obviously just launched into fight or flight mode after waking up and thinking that she was still in danger. When I got upstairs, the girl was half naked, just slouched in the hallway outside the flat, and she was crying her eyes out. I told her to stay put and that the ambulance was on the way. Then all she did was cry those choked sobs while her tears cleared the blood from her face. And that's another image I'll never get out of my head. How her tears actually seemed to clean the blood from the parts of her deformed face they'd touched. When the paramedics arrived, I found out that the only reason she hadn't actually run off after waking up screaming was because she literally couldn't. I don't know what kind of damage had been done to her legs, but the paramedics had to bring in a stretcher up to the hallway to actually get her down into the ambulance. After she was taken to the hospital, a second set of policemen, the first went with her to the hospital, asked me to stay out of the flat on behalf of a forensics team which were on their way down. Then they proceeded to ask me a load of questions regarding exactly what I'd seen and what I knew about the people renting. Obviously, I knew next to nothing other than her name and the amount of time that she'd been staying for, but I answered their questions as best they could. They also promised to keep me in the loop regarding certain details of the investigation so I could pass on the details to our insurance company for the eventual claim we were going to file with them. About a week or so later, I got a call from an officer, and while he didn't tell me exactly what had happened, he told me everything he was permitted to tell me. Basically, the two girls who rented the flat were call girls who'd come down from the north to use the place as a kind of base of operations for 3 weeks because they could basically charge more for their services in London than they could up north. At least, that was their logic. Apparently, their little idea had worked really well, and they'd had a profitable, relatively trouble-free few weeks. But then, on the night before they'd been due to check out, some local gangsters had gotten wind of their little operation and didn't take kindly to them operating in their area. Apparently, these girls were charging quite a bit of money, but it was still lower than the rate that these gangsters had agreed upon for all their girls. So, they hatched a little plan. They would raid the flat the girls were staying in, scare them enough that they'd leave the area, and take any money they'd made in the process. But the thing was, The girls didn't keep much money in the flat with them, and were taking the cash to a friend of theirs who just so happened to live in London too. That's how only one girl ended up getting left in the bath. She ended up being the only one they beat the crap out of and torturing as a means of scaring the other girl, who they forced out of the window before making her lead them to where they'd stashed all their money. And that was all I was told. And as much as the officer hinted that they got a few blokes in custody, he obviously couldn't tell me who they were or who they were affiliated with. And that's all the info I got too, as the police didn't get back in touch aside to tell us that we were free to use the apartment again, and I was more focused on the insurance claim than anything else after that. That was the single worst incident in the history of our little Airbnb business, and probably one of the worst things I'd ever come across in my entire life. Okay, so a few years back, me and my girlfriend decided to get out of the city for a few days by renting an Airbnb. We spent a while looking at a bunch of different places, then finally settled in this place on a farm about 2 hours' drive outside of the city. It was this little guest house on a farm, just across from the main house where the owners must have lived. We talked a little via email after actually paying for the place. Just little things like if we wanted some wine or some coffee left for our arrival. They were really friendly like that. Then just a few days before we were due to drive out there, they suddenly stopped replying to our emails. It was a little worrying, but not hugely so. I mean, we paid our fees and stuff, so we were definitely entitled to rent the little guest house for the week that we paid for. Besides, we figured that they were just busy or something and would get back to us as soon as they could. They told us in one email that the keys to the place would be in a lockbox that was attached to the place's porch, and that they'd email us the code on either the day before we arrived or the day of our arrival for security reasons. But then, like I said, they seemed to just go totally dark just a few days before, and they ended up not emailing us any kind of code. We were kind of annoyed, as anyone might be, and as we'd already paid our money and all that. I know we probably should have just canceled the trip and got a refund from Airbnb, but we really liked the idea of staying out on this farm place, as it would make the perfect little break from our busy urban lives. So we decided to just roll the dice, drive out there and get the code to the lockbox by knocking at the actual farmhouse instead of relying on email and stuff. The place was relatively easy to find, and both the farmhouse and the little guest house looked awesome. There was just one problem. The door to the main house was wide open, and there was a trail of clothes and household items leading up to a spot that looked like a truck or car had once sat. As you can guess, we could instantly tell that something wasn't right, as it looked like whoever had lived there had left in a hurry for some reason. Just to be sure, we walked up to the door, knocked on it, even thought it was open and called out, "Hello?" and stuff like that. We didn't get any reply, so there was definitely no one home, and we didn't actually have any of their numbers, so there was no getting in touch with them to find out where they'd gone or when they'd be back. Not that we actually thought that they were coming back anytime soon. The trail of stuff gave us a pretty good idea that no one would want to be returning at all. The only real questions we were faced with was, why the hell did the family leave in such a hurry? And what exactly scared them so bad that they'd want to leave so fast? We didn't exactly stick around for very long. The bad vibes were seriously heavy in the air, and my girlfriend was begging me to get us out of there from almost the moment we got out of the car. But in the time we were there, we didn't see any blood or anything like that. No bullet holes either. Nothing to indicate what had happened to make people want to run away. We made sure to call the cops on the way back into the city just to let them know that something had happened if they didn't know already. Getting our money back from Airbnb was actually much easier than we figured, too. I guess they couldn't get in touch with the family either, and since it was still the day that we were due to check in, the money was still in digital limbo or whatever system they used to get us the money pretty quickly. I always wondered about what happened to the family, though. We didn't end up getting any real answers about it, other than the fact that we got our money back pretty quickly, which I'm guessing meant that they didn't contest the refund with Airbnb. We've rented Airbnbs since then too, with none of that same creepiness being repeated. So while I definitely recommend using the company, I suppose you just don't know what you're walking into until you're actually there.
When I turned 26, my friends and I decided to rent a small lakeside cabin that we found on Airbnb to have some fun on the lake for my birthday. It was a really cool idea, and I'll never forget my friends for being kind enough to do that for me. I mean, it wasn't the best birthday I ever had, but they couldn't have accounted for what was going to happen. You see, we got to the cabin on Thursday at around 4 p.m., so there was still enough time to swim for a bit before it got dark. As soon as we realized that, we all just ran inside, tossed our stuff on the beds, and then got ready to hit the lake. We swam for about an hour before deciding to call it a night and relax with some food and a fire. I brought my guitar, and we all had a good time before we ended up getting tired. But eventually, it was time to put out the fire and go to bed. We all went inside and hung out for another couple of minutes before splitting into the 2 rooms and hitting the hay. The bed wasn't too comfortable, but after swimming and eating way too much junk, I ended up passing out without any problems. Now normally, I'm a really heavy sleeper. The only thing that wakes me up is when something makes me move or touches my face. And I remember being woken up by the feeling of something tickling my nose, which caused me to swat whatever it was away and roll over to my side, which was when I heard a strange, whispering sort of noise. I couldn't tell what it was, but I was far too tired, so assuming it was just my buddies messing with me, I said, "Cut it out, I'm trying to sleep." That was when I heard the noise again, so this time I sat up and turned to yell at the guys who I thought were messing with me, but to my surprise, no one was there, and Kyle, my friend who I was sharing the room with, he was still knocked out. I shook my head and figured that I must have felt a fly or something land on my face before deciding to lie back down. As I closed my eyes, I could tell that I was going to be asleep in no time. But before I could get there, the noise was back. I couldn't make it out, but I swear it was like a whisper or someone snickering. Only this time, the sound was coming from the foot of my bed. I wasn't messing around anymore, and this time I sprang from my bed ready to confront whoever was messing with me. But again, there was nothing there. But as I looked back toward the bed, I realized what I had been hearing. It wasn't whispering at all. Instead, it was the quiet hissing of a snake that had somehow made its way into my bed. I freaked out and woke up Kyle, who responded the same. We woke up the other 2 guys who were with us to check the whole cabin to see if there were any other animal intruders, as we also figured out how to remove the snake from my bed. None of us could tell if it was venomous or not, but eventually, we figured out how to get it into a pillowcase and brought it out of the woods before letting it go. I didn't get any sleep the entire 3 days that we were at the cabin. There was no way, not after a snake woke me up by touching my face. It's definitely a birthday I'll never forget. In the summer of 2014, my wife Joanne, who at the time was just my fiance, and I went on a cross-country trip for the summer with the hopes of hitting all of the biggest sites along the way, from the Grand Canyon to see the giant redwoods in Grizzly State Park, where they shot the Forest Moon of Endor scenes from Star Wars. It was a really great trip, despite a few hiccups, and we learned a lot of really good lessons along the way. The biggest of which might have been to stick with hotels because Airbnbs cannot be trusted. We were passing through Montana, and on Airbnb, we found a nice looking house to stay in that wasn't too expensive and didn't seem to have any neighbors aside from the owner of the house who lived on his own home right next door. When we got there, the house looked really nice. The interior was really simple and it only had 1 bedroom. a living room, a bathroom, and a kitchen, so it wasn't too big. It was perfect for just the two of us, especially since we only planned on staying for one night. After getting settled in, my fiance and I decided to get ourselves cleaned up, and as a way to save some water, we both decided to hop in the shower together. Now, before getting in, both of us put our bags on the bed in the bedroom, but if I remember right, neither of us had removed any of our belongings, aside from the clothes that we were going to change into. Then we both went into the bathroom at the same time and didn't get out until we were finished getting cleaned up. But when we got out of the bathroom and went into the bedroom, I noticed that there were more of the clothes on the bed than we left out. That means that someone was going through our stuff while we were in the bathroom. I tried to shake the thought out of my head and told myself that Joanne must have just been looking for something and I just wasn't remembering right. After getting dressed, the two of us were feeling hungry and decided to go out for some dinner at a local diner, which ended up being really pleasant. That would be the last nice feeling that we would have that night. After returning to the house that we had rented for the night, Joanne made her way up to the door and then inside as I grabbed the leftovers from the car and locked it up. But before I could finish locking the door, I heard her let out a loud scream. I ran into the house as fast as I could and saw Joanne pointing toward the bedroom. I asked her what happened, and she said that when she walked into the house, she heard something slam closed in the bedroom. Making my way over to the bedroom door, I very cautiously stuck my head in, but I didn't see anything. I looked over to the closet. The door was still open as we left it, and there was no one in the room as far as I could see. I walked over to the bed and checked underneath, but there was nothing. I tried to convince Joanne that the pressure change from the door opening and closing probably shut one of the cabinets in the kitchen or something, and eventually, we were able to calm ourselves down and get some sleep. I wish I had listened to her more though. Later that night, I woke up to use the bathroom, and as I was making my way back into the bed, I heard what sounded to me like heavy breathing. I looked over to Joanne, but it wasn't coming from that direction. It sounded like it was coming from the wall. I slowly made my way over to the wall near the nightstand beside our bed, and as I went to place my ear against it, I could hear the sound of something scampering away, followed by the sound of something closing shut. I ran over to the window to look outside, and I saw someone running across the yard toward the owner's house. I woke Joanne up, and we called the cops. We turned on the lights, and we made sure all of the windows and doors were locked. After taking a closer look at the wall, I noticed a small seam that ran down the wall and was hidden right behind the nightstand. And after the police arrived, they checked it out and found a small cubby-like room that led to a small hatch on the back of the house. The police went up to the owner's house to question him about it, but they apparently couldn't find him, and according to them, even if the owner was hiding in the wall, it was his property, so it technically wasn't illegal. Joanne and I decided to book a room at the nearby hotel that had a vacancy and moved our stuff over there before deciding to never use Airbnb again. Sometimes the creepiest people live less than an hour away from you, and you wouldn't even know it unless you happened to interact with them. I learned this lesson when my house became infested with bed bugs after my cousin visited and we had to get it fumigated. This meant that we all had to stay away from the house for 3 full days before it was safe for us to go back inside. So to make the best of a bad situation, my mom and dad decided to rent a nice looking Airbnb that was just outside the city. It was supposed to be really exciting because I had never left the confines of New York City until then. So as a 13-year-old, I was pretty hyped, but things didn't exactly turn out as great as I hoped. When we pulled up to the house, it all looked great. They had a fenced-in yard and a long driveway with a basketball hoop and a ball for us to play with, and there was even a big motion sensor light in case we wanted to play outside after dark. My parents and I rushed into the house and began checking it out before ultimately getting settled in. Once we got comfortable, we ate some dinner and decided to go for a short walk afterwards to check out the area before it got too dark. The little neighborhood that the house was in looked nice. There was a few houses on the street, and they all looked similar. The trees that lined the road were really nice, and the fact that I could actually hear some insects was astounding to me compared to the rush of the city. But on our way back to the house, things got a little odd when we noticed that someone was standing at the end of their driveway, just staring at the house. As we got closer, my dad said hello and introduced himself by letting the man know that we were staying there for a few days, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he just looked at my dad and then at my mom and me before turning around and walking down the street away from us. It was one of the weirdest things I had experienced up until that point in my life. The three of us made our way into the house quickly and double-locked the door behind us before sitting down and finding a movie to watch. And after a while, it was time to go to bed, and we were all feeling a bit weird after we saw that man. So instead of sleeping in separate rooms as we planned, we all decided to fall asleep in the living room. The three of us ended up falling asleep for a while before I was woken up by a sudden flash of light coming through the window. I looked toward it from the couch, and I could tell that it was the motion sensor light in the driveway, and it might have just turned on, so I got up to see what it was, thinking it might have been a dog or something. But I was wrong, and the scream that I let out woke up both my parents. They looked at me and then toward the window where they saw the same man from before, just standing at the end of the driveway, staring toward the house. My mom got out her phone to call the owner of the Airbnb as my dad ran to the front door and began screaming at the man. As soon as he saw my dad, he took off running. And when my mom got off the phone with the person we were renting the house from, we all decided to find different sleeping arrangements because according to the owner, that was just the neighbor. She said he's always been obsessed with the house and stopped by multiple times a day and night just to look at it for some reason. That didn't sit right with us, and we ended up just staying at a motel until our place was finished being fumigated.
This story happened just last month. My wife and I were planning to take a little vacation just for the weekend. We found an Airbnb up in a really nice area with a lot of great land. The place was way up north, about 4 hours away. It was a house, sort of like a cabin, and was up on a hill with a really nice deck overlooking the massive amount of land nearby. The area was mostly woods, hills, and just land. We also really liked it because of how secluded it was from the rest of the houses. There weren't really any other buildings or houses in sight. In fact, most areas over there were just vacation homes or cabins. We drove up there early Friday morning and arrived to the property at about 10 a.m. When we got there, we had a great time just relaxing and enjoying the area. It didn't take long, though, before our trip took a turn for the worst. That night, as we were just sitting in the living room of the house watching a movie, all of a sudden we heard a knocking sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from at first, but after pausing the movie and getting up, I could tell it was coming from one of the windows. I walked down a hallway to where the noise was coming from. As I got closer, I was able to locate the window, and then the knocking stopped. I reached the window where it was coming from, but I didn't see anything when I looked outside of it. However, I didn't have a good feeling about it, because the house was so secluded, and most parts of it were surrounded by trees and bushes. I knew anybody being around here at all would be suspicious. As I walked back to the living room, my wife asked me if I saw what was causing the knocking. Just as I was telling her about it, we then heard a loud pounding coming from the front door. It sounded as though somebody was trying to break the entire door down. I walked back over to the kitchen area to try and look out the window and see, but once again, when I got at an angle to actually see who was at the front door, the noises had stopped, and whoever was there was now gone. After this, we didn't hear any more noises for a while. I thought maybe whoever it was had now left. But about 30 minutes later, we heard the sound outside, just barely, of a man yelling. I couldn't tell what he was saying. In fact, I'm not sure if he was saying anything at all. We knew somebody was trying to mess with us, or get inside the house for some reason. We would hear noises or bangs against the house, but whenever we looked out the window, whoever was there somehow disappeared. This happened a couple of more times, and my wife and I were getting concerned. We didn't really feel comfortable going to bed with all this going on. It was getting late though, and I decided if we were in fact going to sleep there, I would go outside and take a look around. My I went out the front door and took a walk all around the house, but saw nothing strange and didn't hear anything either. I hoped that meant whoever was there was now gone, and I went back inside. We decided we would go to bed, but if anything else happened at all, we would call the police immediately. Once we had both got to bed and turned out all the lights, almost right away, there was a sudden sound of glass breaking coming from the opposite end of the house. My wife grabbed her phone and started calling the police. I shut the door and locked it, and then started packing up all of our stuff. There was no chance I was going to continue to stay here with all of this going on. We didn't really hear any noises though as we waited for the police to arrive. It took them a while to reach the house with it being way out there, probably like 20 minutes. Thankfully, nobody tried to enter the bedroom we were in during that time. When the police arrived, my wife and I left the room with our bags packed. The police showed us a window in the living room of the house which had been broken, and there was some glass on the ground around it, but after searching the house, they didn't find anybody inside. I didn't feel safe though. After the police left, my wife and I did the same, and we checked into a hotel. A couple of years ago, I traveled to a city for a prospective job. I had a potential job offer and was going to stay a total of 2 days to look at the area in case I were to move there. I didn't really spend a whole lot of time looking for where to stay. I kind of just went onto the Airbnb app, found a place that looked good, and then went for it. I do remember though that the owner seemed like a really nice guy. When I arrived, the place itself was decent. It was a little place right by the city. I got the keys and got inside to drop off my stuff. After that, I went out for a few hours and then returned that night. I went to bed that night pretty early. I've always been kind of an early bird and I'm used to it. However, I woke up in seemingly the middle of the night, which is unusual. When I woke up, I looked around confused after seeing it was still dark outside and clearly nighttime. I looked at the clock to see that it was 2:30 a.m. and I remember, just as I was looking at the clock, I heard the sound of the front door to the house being opened. The house had been completely silent, and hearing that was a scary moment. I knew nobody else was supposed to be in the house. I'm not really sure what I was thinking. Maybe it was because I had just woken up and wasn't thinking clearly, but I grabbed the blankets and covered myself with them like a little kid. I then heard footsteps starting to come closer to the bedroom that I was in. My heart started to race like crazy, and I was terrified. I sort of came to my senses and knew that hiding under the covers was a bad idea, but what could I do? I had no time to prepare for this. As the footsteps got closer, it was clear to me that they would likely come in the bedroom. The only thing I thought to do was pretend to still be asleep. Maybe, just maybe, if somebody was going to rob the house or something like that, if they saw that I was fast asleep, they would just ignore me. I also felt this was my only option, because I had no time to run to the closet and hide, or grab something to use as a weapon. I didn't even have time to dial 911, as my phone was charging on the desk, not within my reach. Once whoever was there reached the door, I heard it open, and I closed my eyes and pretended to be sound asleep. I heard whoever was there take 2 steps inside the room or so, and then they just stopped. I didn't hear any more noises or movement for about a whole minute. Very carefully, I opened my eyes just a crack. I was careful to make it look like they were still closed, but I wanted to see whoever was in there. As soon as my eyes cracked open, I saw somebody standing right in front of the doorway, facing me. I looked at them for a couple of seconds. Then I recognized them. It was the man who owned the Airbnb. I remembered him from his picture. He was just standing there staring at me, with no expression on his face. I was careful to close my eyes without making it look like they had ever been open. I was terrified and also very confused as to what he was doing here. He stayed there for probably 5 more minutes and didn't move. It felt like forever, and I was just waiting for him to do something. Finally, I heard him turn around and then walk away. I laid in bed, listening carefully to wherever the man moved throughout the house. He went straight for the door and then just left. After that, I stayed up for about 2 more hours before I could get back to sleep. Luckily, the guy never returned. The next day, I contacted the owner of the Airbnb and asked him what he was doing in the house during the night. He denied being there completely. I reported him after that and did not return back. That was the last time I used Airbnb.